towering fairy tale castle looms beneath a churning sky, harboring the terrifying legend of a wicked woman whispered throughout this ancient country. Standing silhouetted among blood-red spider lilies, the infamous Villainess turns away as her monstrous acts of wickedness echo down through countless generations. Consumed by burning jealousy after her beloved fiancé was cruelly stolen from her, the desperate princess unleashed forbidden magic to summon a colossal demon amid crashing lightning. Weeping and smiling in broken madness, the most infamous witch of her era is remembered as talentless and incompetent, her cursed name being Princess Berjeanne. The truth is far crueler than the legend, for she was neither the worst witch of her era nor talentless, but a pitiful princess who genuinely possessed magical talent. Yet the world mercilessly exploited her gifts, and in her current life she buries her magical talent completely, enduring daily insults while living as someone utterly without ability. A vicious hand slams down onto the dining table, sending cutlery flying as a furious voice condemns her as the absolute disgrace of the Roble family. Seated alone at the far end of the immaculate banquet hall, she silently absorbs accusations of lacking basic education and being incapable of properly using magic. Towering over her with a face twisted in pure venom, her mother furiously demands to know why such a worthless daughter even exists at all. Jabbing a merciless finger directly at her, the enraged noblewoman screams that it would have been infinitely better if her own daughter had never been born. Smiling faintly behind a delicate hand, the silver-haired girl calmly continues her meal, completely unbothered by the poison hurled across the table. Lavianje, the 16-year-old eldest daughter of the Roble family, one of the 4 great ducal houses of Roble, alone knows the truth that the infamous Princess Berjeanne was her own past life. Her sharp-eyed brother coolly interjects, coldly listing her constant escape from studies, her dismal grades, and her placement in the lowest D class. Turning his gaze aside with icy disdain, he warns his disgraced sister to be acutely aware of exactly who her fiancé is. Setting aside her utter lack of magical power, he bitterly declares he resents that someone who willingly chooses ignorance is his own sister. Clutching her fork in visible distress, the stepsister desperately pleads with their father to intervene and stop mother and brother from attacking her. Dabbing at her eyes with practiced grace, the delicate stepsister gently insists that even if the accusations are true, Lavianje is surely making a genuine effort. Sneaking a calculating glance across the table, she softly protests that blaming her that much seems far too harsh. Behind her trembling hand, the stepsister's tearful expression twists into a chilling smirk as she inwardly savors just how pitiful Lavianje truly is. Sitting with her back to the storm of contempt, Lavianje merely sighs internally, resigned that the daily barrage of insults directed at her is starting all over again. Abandoned cutlery rests across an untouched plate as she quietly mourns that yet another delicious meal has been completely ruined by her family's venom. Gazing serenely into the distance, she admits this daily humiliation is entirely her own doing, since she deliberately buried her immense power to live as a talentless, incompetent person. Smiling knowingly among the drifting spider lilies, she reveals she is currently living her 3rd life while retaining full memories of the previous 2, having long surpassed a total age of 100 years. Crossing her arms with smug satisfaction, the tiny reincarnated princess cheerfully concludes that being talentless and incompetent is by far the most convenient path to a peaceful existence. Her hairpin flies loose as blinding light erupts behind her, a violent reminder of her brutal past life as Princess Berjeanne, the infamous villainess who tried to destroy an entire country. Cracked stone and splattered ink linger in the silence, the shattered remnants of a life she now looks back upon as unbearably heavy. As a healing reaction, her previous life was spent as an ordinary Japanese woman who passed away peacefully at 86, mending every wound Berjeanne's disastrous existence had inflicted. Yet cruel fate refused to let her rest, twisting the gears of destiny even as she desperately begged to live peacefully just once more. Counting off her 3 lives on her fingers, she groans that reincarnating back into Roble has cursed her with overwhelming magical talent all over again. Clenching her fist with fierce conviction, she demands to know whether a light life without magical talent isn't infinitely better than a heavy one crushed beneath its weight. Beaming with radiant, unshakable determination, she declares that in this 3rd life she will live as a talentless and powerless person no matter what it costs her. Her eye narrows sharply behind a curtain of pale hair as an unspoken resolve hardens into something far colder. Standing over the ruined table, her mother and stepsister continue unleashing their twisted emotions onto her without a single shred of restraint. Sipping wine in complete detachment, her indifferent father ignores everything while her brother's icy contempt registers as nothing more than background noise. Hiding a wicked grin behind her delicate hand, Sienna savors the moment, cooing about what a truly pitiful stepsister she has. Bowing her head with a razor-thin smile, Lavianje sweetly thanks Sienna for her deeply touching concern. Tilting her face gently, she calmly warns her stepsister that unless she angles it 3 times to the left, everyone will clearly see the expression she is currently wearing. Recoiling in theatrical horror, Sienna shrieks in outrage, demanding to know if pitying her elder sister makes her face ugly. Rushing to console the sobbing girl, their mother clutches Sienna's shoulders while condemning Laviange's remark as unspeakably cruel. Her mother whips around with a bulging, bloodshot glare, her face contorting into pure murderous fury. Erupting into full-blown hysteria, her mother shrieks that she is useless with a terrible personality, furiously demanding to know why she must share a table with such a hopeless child. Swirling his wine with cold detachment, her father finally exhales a single, weary breath at the unpleasant spectacle unfolding before him. Slamming his glass down with brutal finality, the Duke's voice cuts through the chaos as he coldly commands them to leave the room. Smirking in vicious triumph, her mother and stepsister exchange a satisfied glance, utterly convinced their tormented target has finally been banished. Lavianje lowers her gaze in silent, wordless resignation, bracing herself for yet another humiliating dismissal. Grinning venomously as she rises, the stepsister gleefully urges Lavianje to hurry up and get out of the dining hall. Fixing them with an unamused stare from the head of the table, their father calmly clarifies that the ones leaving are the 2 who caused the commotion. Blood drains from their faces as mother and daughter freeze in absolute, dumbfounded shock at the unthinkable reversal. Glaring sidelong with icy authority, the Duke reminds them he has already declared meals must remain quiet, vowing to expel anyone who disrupts them again. Panicked protests erupt as the mother frantically insists she only raised her voice because of Lavianje, while Sienna desperately screams for their father to wait. A soft sound of realization escapes Lavianje as she glances toward the suddenly silent doorway. Teleported, soundproofed, and magically locked outside, the 2 women pound uselessly against the sealed doors while she casually notes their muffled struggle. Settling back into her seat as her brother Mikhail is told to continue as he pleases, Lavianje marvels that this is the very first time she can enjoy a full-course meal to the end. Slicing calmly into perfectly cooked meat, she reflects that delicious food alone brings her happiness and remains one of life's absolute essentials. Savoring each bite with quiet contentment, she muses that if that is truly the case, then her father's cold indifference carries a hidden mercy. Beaming with a serene, blissful smile, she cheerfully concludes that his complete impartiality could in a way be called perfect equality. Nestled deep in the quiet countryside, a rustic log house stands peacefully as a satisfied sigh drifts out from within. Eyeing the untouched strawberry dessert beside her teapot, she happily schemes to secretly request the nostalgic treat all over again. Reading leisurely by lamplight, she reveals this log house was originally her punishment and banishment, yet its peaceful solitude has made her genuinely love it despite the constant cold. Her eye widens sharply as heavy, approaching footsteps thunder toward her sanctuary, instantly shattering the fragile peace. Bursting through the log house door in a whirlwind of fury, Sienna shrieks that her big sister has gone entirely too far this time. Unfazed by the violent intrusion, Lavianje calmly greets her stepsister and casually invites the raging girl to take a seat. Slamming both hands onto the table, Sienna furiously refuses to let her dodge the issue, screaming that her precious dinner with father was completely ruined. Sighing inwardly with a wry smile, Lavianje laments that there is always some nuisance ready to shatter a perfectly lovely moment. Watching her stepsister's explosive tantrum, she privately observes that Sienna's emotional outbursts mirror her mother's dining hall rampage so perfectly that the girl seems more like the real daughter. The truth, however, is that Sienna was originally her cousin before ever becoming her stepsister. Younger by exactly 1 year, the orphaned girl lost her parents in a tragic accident and was raised alone until age 11, when the Roble family finally adopted her. Covering her mouth in quiet amusement, Lavianje mentally likens the yowling, threatening pair to a hissing little kitten and its screeching mother. Catching the suspicious silence, Sienna demands to know what she is thinking, and Lavianje sweetly insists it is absolutely nothing at all. Pounding the tea table in renewed rage, Sienna orders her not to play dumb and furiously demands to know what happened to her father. Eyes wild with accusation, she screams that Lavianje got them both thrown out, that mother is absolutely livid and threatens to report everything to Lord Schwa at the academy tomorrow. Jabbing an accusing finger across the room, Sienna gleefully warns that her reputation will be destroyed and her position as fiancé thrown into mortal danger. Smirking with poisonous delight, the stepsister inwardly savors the thought of Laviange's suffering and misery, since the arrangement only lasts until she herself becomes Lord Schwa's fiancé. Turning her head with an unbothered smile, Lavianje gently points out that the second prince's father is the one who actually decides such matters. Grinning cheerfully with closed eyes, she calmly notes that no amount of wishing will ever put that decision within Sienna's control. Recoiling as though physically struck, Sienna's face twists into a snarl of pure, humiliated rage. Screaming with both fists clenched, she demands to know why someone who can't do anything dares to act so high and mighty. Baring her teeth in a final desperate jab, she declares that Laviange's disgraceful grades are a stain upon the entire household. Beneath the table, Laviange's fingers move in a small, discreet gesture as magic quietly stirs to life. Mid-tirade, Sienna's mouth continues flapping uselessly as every single sound is stolen straight from her throat. Smiling serenely in the sudden blessed quiet, she admits the noise was simply unbearable and cheerfully concludes that following her father's example was not bad at all. Her half-lidded gaze drifts sideways as she notes she already knows every word Sienna intends to say without ever needing to hear it. Right on cue, the silenced girl rages soundlessly, accusing her of being uneducated and talentless and demanding she stop clinging to the second prince's fiancé position. Walking through a garden of thorned white roses, she recites the familiar accusation that she is just like the infamous Villainess Berjeanne who interfered with her fiancé's true love. Shrugging with practiced boredom, she cheerfully declares she has heard the identical speech so many times that she has completely memorized it. Watching her stepsister storm away in a huff of steam, Lavianje calmly observes that Sienna has finally said everything she wanted to say. The door explodes shut with a violent, shuddering crash that rattles the entire log house. Marching off with puffs of fury trailing behind her, Sienna leaves the battered wooden door swinging crookedly in her wake. Sweat dropping at the broken hinge, Lavianje dryly wonders whether such door-slamming behavior is really what people call a proper lady. Pouring herself a fresh cup of tea, she quietly murmurs that even so, something about the accusation lingers. Sipping slowly with closed eyes, she muses over the strange notion of supposedly interfering with someone else's fiancé. Envisioning Sienna wrapped intimately in the second prince's arms, she wryly wonders when exactly she became the villain obstructing their blossoming true love. Startled mid-thought by a shrill voice complaining her tea is far too sweet, Lavianje blinks in surprise and remarks that she personally doesn't mind it at all. A fluffy white creature perched atop her head bluntly proposes that they simply kill the man outright. Glancing upward in alarm, she asks Casjon why she has suddenly declared murder, and the beast snaps that the man is bullying her beloved Lavi again. Puffing up in righteous fury, the tiny sacred beast fumes that the stupid prince, his mistress, and all his lackeys never stop causing trouble for Lavi. This fluffy little roommate is the sacred beast Casquette, affectionately called Casjon, a treasured friendship carried over from her past life. Deadpanning up at her furious companion, Lavianje reminds Casjon they said exactly this in the past and were killed for it, since even a useless man remains royalty. Blinking with a faintly troubled expression, she hums in reluctant agreement that the point is admittedly true. Standing coolly among pale blossoms, her fiancé Schwa Robes, the second prince and the same age as her older brother, is himself a direct descendant of the infamous Villainess Berjeanne. Standing beneath the towering blade, the Golden Prince carries the weight of a legendary bloodline, for the man who struck down Belshanu was none other than his own grandfather. Learning her fiancé's heart belonged to another, the jealousy-consumed Villainess rampaged with terrible fury and nearly shattered an entire nation, until legend claims his righteous hand brilliantly struck her down. Knowing the ugly truth buried beneath that heroic legend, the furious Casjon absolutely refuses to accept a single word of it. Stamping her tiny paw against the floor in seething indignation, the sacred beast makes her blazing anger unmistakably clear. Throwing her head back with an ear-splitting howl, the fluffy little creature furiously declares that she is seriously, thoroughly pissed off. Completely ignoring the raging tirade, a blissfully melting Lavianje gushes over how utterly adorable her fuming companion looks today as Casjon demands to know if she's even listening. Beaming radiantly with her hands pressed together, the shameless duke's daughter cheerfully insists that she is absolutely listening. Smoothly changing the subject, Lavianje warmly compliments the polka dot scrunchie and confesses her quiet happiness that the sacred beast never takes it off. Glowing with triumphant self-satisfaction, the 100-year-old schemer smugly notes that redirecting the conversation works wonders for banishing a bad mood. Softening her voice with genuine affection, she reveals she sewed the scrunchie stitch by stitch, embedding powerful protective magic perfectly suited to Casjon, and would be overjoyed if her friend kept it always. Puffing up her enormous tails in radiant, sparkling delight, the thoroughly flattered Casjon happily chirps her wholehearted agreement. Clutching her chest as her eyes explode into shining stars, Lavianje suffers a devastating direct hit of pure, overwhelming cuteness. Lunging forward to bury her hands in that irresistibly soft coat, the ecstatic Villainess wildly rubs the squirming beast while babbling about her unbearable adorableness. Pinned helplessly beneath the relentless petting, a flattened Casjon flatly informs Lavi that she currently looks like a complete and total pervert. Grinning with unhinged bliss and drooling faintly, the enraptured Duke's daughter dissolves into breathless giggling over her impossibly cute companion. Radiating a sudden, terrifying menace, the tiny sacred beast icily threatens to sleep in an entirely separate room if the disgraceful behavior does not cease immediately. Wilting instantly in genuine remorse, a chastened Lavianje mumbles a sincere apology while the exasperated Casjon grudgingly forgives her. Trotting off with her tail swishing imperiously, the sacred beast orders Lavi to hurry along to bed, and the smiling girl promises to follow shortly. Left alone in the quiet log house as her fluffy friend departs, Lavianje sits perfectly still at the small table beneath the flickering lamplight. Her gentle smile slowly curling into something sharp and knowing, the reincarnated Villainess reveals a glimpse of the century-old darkness sleeping behind those calm eyes. Calmly predicting tomorrow's inevitable spectacle, Lavianje knows the second prince will storm at her the instant Sienna delivers her tearful, poisonous report. To a woman carrying a full century of memories behind her young face, watching the pair scheme feels no more threatening than observing a little bird hop about. Slipping quietly toward her bed, the ancient soul admits the deeply bizarre sensation of being betrothed to what amounts to her own grandson. Stepping out of her shoes onto the woven rug, she sighs that calling off the wretched engagement remains stubbornly out of reach, which is nothing but troublesome. Resting her hand on the softly sleeping sacred beast, Lavianje murmurs a tender goodnight, quietly wishing only for a peaceful life beside Casjon and the others. The very next day at the academy, a booming voice shatters the corridor's calm by barking her full name, and the unsurprised Villainess muses that he came running after all. Blocking the sunlit hallway with his entourage, the second prince glares furiously while Sienna cowers behind him and Mikhail looks on with folded arms. Radiating royal indignation, the fair-haired Schwa Robes fixes his talentless fiancé with a cold, contemptuous stare. Sweeping his arm wide in theatrical accusation, the prince coldly greets her before declaring he has heard exactly what terrible thing she did. Smirking behind her hand in vicious triumph, Sienna listens as Schwa condemns Lavianje as rotten to the core for tormenting her own younger sister. Sighing inwardly like an exasperated grandmother, the century-old soul marvels that the prince still swallows such transparent lies and decides he desperately needs a bit of advice. Meeting his glare without flinching, Lavianje flatly replies that she recalls doing absolutely nothing of the sort. Tilting her head with a sweet, luminous smile, the Villainess gently informs His Highness that his face is really quite unfortunate. Snapping instantly at the devastating insult, the enraged prince slams the wall and roars at her in blind fury. Grabbing at her with wild indignation, Schwa screams that an incompetent, talentless nobody dares to give orders to royalty and demands she stop messing with him. Answering his rage with serene composure, she calmly points out that he glares like a scowling knight and questions whether bellowing across the school beside a woman who isn't his fiancée truly befits royalty. Frozen mid-shout as the whispering students stare, the humiliated prince goes rigid while Lavianje sweetly reminds him that maintaining his public image matters too. Clutching her hands in wide-eyed theatrical horror, Sienna gasps that such words are terrifying and demands to know if Lavianje even considers her own position. Covering her mouth in mock contrition, the Villainess offers a poisonously polite apology for her rudeness. Walking away down the polished corridor, she coolly notes she doesn't appreciate being falsely accused of something she never did, and that this entire mess began with Sienna in the first place. Turning on her heel with a serene smile, Lavianje coolly asks whether His Highness has finished speaking and bids him a crisp farewell. A hand shoots out and clamps brutally around her slender wrist as the furious prince barks at her to wait. A sharp gasp catches in her throat as the reincarnated Villainess freezes, genuinely startled by the sudden violence. Looming over her with cold disdain, Schwa sneers that she is exactly as rumored, talentless, incompetent and mean-spirited, and demands to know if she enjoys tormenting her own sister. Yanking her wrist higher, the enraged prince rages that she bullies others while ignoring her own worthlessness, and snarls to know who this useless fool thinks she is. Her half-lidded eyes darken dangerously as the ancient soul muses that a man who cannot accept advice and resorts to brute force against a lady might finally deserve her anger. Meeting his glare with a razor-thin smile, she calmly answers that she is, for the moment, the prince's fiancé, and points out his accusations missed the mark entirely. His grip crushes tighter as the incensed royal roars that a useless fool dares to mock him. A quiet, dangerous flicker crosses her face as she lifts her free hand with a soft, ominous sigh. Grimacing openly as the bones grind beneath his fingers, Lavianje admits with brutal honesty that it genuinely hurts. Whispers ripple through the watching students as she flatly requests that His Highness release her at once. The prince's fingers only tighten, digging viciously into her pale skin without a shred of mercy. Half hidden behind him, Sienna chews her lip and stifles a delighted, venomous little smile at the sight. Sweating uncomfortably, Mikhail finally breaks and mutters that Schwa has already gone far enough. An icy silence falls as the two lock eyes, her cold composure meeting his burning fury across an invisible battle line. Something snaps as the prince abruptly releases her and recoils, his hand hovering uselessly in the air. Cradling her throbbing, reddening wrist, Lavianje remarks with mild interest that the bruise is really starting to swell. Averting his gaze with a stiff, defensive grunt, Schwa sullenly accuses her of exaggerating the injury. Sweat beads on his temple as his wide eye locks onto the ugly, darkening marks blooming across her delicate arm. Standing frozen beneath the chandelier with Mikhail beside him, the shaken prince clutches his own hand, utterly unable to speak. Cradling her injured arm with perfect politeness, Lavianje requests permission to visit the infirmary, noting it is her dominant arm and she would rather it not hinder tomorrow's joint class. Panic floods the prince's face as he stammers for her to wait. Instantly reading his intent to erase the evidence with healing magic, the villainess coldly refuses. Turning her back on him entirely, she reflects that being branded a worthless villainess is precisely why everyone believes they may do anything to her, so long as royal privilege permits it and a bit of magic tidies it away afterward. Flinching visibly at her silent condemnation, Schwa desperately protests that harming her was never his intention. Her half-lidded gaze sharpens into something ancient and merciless as she speaks his full name and title aloud. Tilting her head with a devastatingly sweet smile, Lavianje asks why he wears the face of a victim, then coolly informs him that when a man of power settles matters by force, the proper word for it is cowardice. Struck utterly speechless before the watching crowd, both the prince and Mikhail freeze in mortified silence. Savoring her victory behind a single narrowed eye, the century-old soul smugly notes that no noisy little brat could ever hope to defeat a young lady with this much life experience. Grinding out the words through clenched teeth, the defeated prince finally demands to know exactly what she wants. Pressing a hand to her cheek with an angelic smile, Lavianje muses aloud that she truly was harmed this time. Sweeping her gaze across the vaulted ceiling, she proposes that compensation befitting the second prince's fiancé be drawn directly from His Highness's personal assets. Declaring the matter thereby concluded, she leaves Sienna gaping in slack-jawed horror. Bursting forward in shrill outrage, the stepsister screams that Lavianje is actually demanding money from the prince himself. Closing her eyes in weary contempt, the ancient soul laments that Sienna understands nothing despite being handed a perfectly straightforward resolution, and flatly orders her to be quiet. Recoiling as though physically struck, the humiliated girl goes scarlet and trembles with impotent fury. Scurrying away with her hand pressed to her mouth, Sienna flees the corridor while a grim Mikhail watches her go. Turning her merciless attention to her brother, Lavianje names Bane's Ash, the third prince, then quietly asks Mikhail who exactly she is. Sweat breaking across his brow, the cornered heir demands to know her point before she presses him again on whether he truly cannot answer. Standing before the grand ducal manor, she answers for him that regardless of her own will, she remains one of only two legitimate heirs to the house of Roble. Standing amid drifting spider lilies with regal composure, Lavianje declares that the royal family themselves appointed her as the second prince's betrothed, and that this is precisely who she is. Sweating under her merciless logic, Mikhail hears her point out that a man aiming for knighthood ought to consider very carefully whom he will one day serve. Smiling with razor-edged serenity, the ancient soul instructs him that whether knight in training or aid candidate, he must engrave the true essence of knighthood into his heart and offer proper manners and genuine righteousness to his future master. Reeling at her audacity as Mikhail demands to know what she is saying, Lavianje calmly expresses her hope that His Highness will settle the matter swiftly. Gathering her skirt in a flawless, faultless curtsy, the villainess pronounces the affair concluded and bids the assembled company farewell. Sweeping her long hair back as she rises, she leaves the stunned prince and her sweating brother rooted helplessly in place. Her profile drifts past in silence, every strand of pale hair trailing behind her like a banner of quiet triumph. Walking away down the sunlit corridor, she reflects that she chose to live as talentless and incompetent, and that neither her family's coldness nor her fiancé's hatred ever mattered to her. A faint, exhausted sigh escapes her lips as she privately hopes this entire mess does not balloon into an even bigger hassle. Smiling with quiet, unshakable confidence, the reincarnated villainess resolves to live out her days as the incompetent nobody, armed with 100 years of living and 3 full lifetimes of experience. Left behind in the vaulted hallway, the scattered students slowly disperse while the humiliated prince stands frozen in place. Glaring venomously from behind Mikhail's shoulder, Sienna watches her rival depart while both men remain grimly silent. Retreating down the corridor, Lavianje muses that earning Lord Schwa's displeasure should have shocked her sister and left her satisfied, yet somehow it did not. Chewing her fingertip in seething, ugly fury, Sienna spits that her stepsister always irritates her and that she cannot stand the talentless, incompetent woman. Watching her hated rival's serene retreat, the enraged girl vows to drive Lavianje out of her sight and have her exiled from the country entirely. The title card burns across the screen as Sienna's hatred crystallizes into a single declaration that she absolutely despises her stepsister. Fuming at that arrogant, all-knowing smile, she rages that a woman with no talent whatsoever has no right to look so utterly composed. Her hand clenches into a white-knuckled fist as she cedes that she wants Lavianje driven out of this kingdom for good. Turning to face the prince with dark resolve settling over her features, Sienna's poisonous thoughts crystallize into a single, ominous purpose. Sidling up to Schwa with practiced sweetness as Mikhail folds his arms in silent disapproval, the scheming stepsister begins her next quiet move. Sweat beading on his brow, the second prince recoils in visible shock as he demands to know exactly what terrible things were done to her. Tears streaming freely down her flushed cheeks, Sienna wails that her mother and she were both driven out of the dinner party entirely because of her cruel stepsister. Pulling the sobbing girl gently into his arms, Schwa softly begs his poor Sienna not to cry while she trembles out that the pain is simply unbearable. Burning with righteous fury, he seethes that Lavianje made her own sister weep, silently cursing the talentless woman's damnable cruelty. Arms crossed in cold judgment, a stern-faced classmate coldly confirms that she truly is as terrible a noblewoman as every vicious rumor claims. Slamming his fist with explosive rage, the second prince declares he will not forgive that talentless fool any longer and swears to punish her himself. Hiding a wicked smirk behind her delicate hand, the scheming stepsister giggles darkly at the delicious thought of Lord Schwa turning his anger on his own fiancé. Extending his hand with a charming, radiant smile, the second prince exists in an engagement where absolutely no love binds them together. Watching his back with calculating eyes, Sienna gleefully assures herself that even her insufferable stepsister will be utterly shattered, since the engagement is nothing but empty formality. Tilting her head with an infuriatingly serene smile, Lavianje calmly announces the divorce compensation will be drawn from His Highness's personal assets and suggests they settle the matter right here. Sweat rolling down his stunned face, Schwa stands frozen as the composed villainess sweeps past him without a single backward glance. Eyes blown wide with disbelief, Sienna's entire face contorts into a horrified, ink-splattered mask of pure, unfiltered shock. Stomping her foot violently against the polished floor, the enraged stepsister slams her heel down hard enough to crack the very air. Whirling on her heel with bared teeth, Sienna shrieks in absolute fury, demanding to know what on earth this outrageous outcome even is. Pressing a hand to her chest in performative anguish, she rages that her beloved fiancé said all those things and she was even injured, so how could she possibly not be shocked? Grinding her teeth behind a trembling finger, the scheming girl snarls that she had fully expected to witness her stepsister's face utterly flooded with despair. Storming off in a black cloud of resentment, She ignores a bewildered classmate nervously asking exactly where she is going. Spinning around with wild, bloodshot eyes, Sienna screams that she is marching straight to her brother. Stamping furiously down the corridor, she declares she absolutely needs her brother to scold that insufferable stepsister properly. Rounding on her silent companion with desperate insistence, she demands the girl agree that her stepsister's attitude was far too awful, receiving only an awkward, wordless stare in return. Roaring directly into her cowering friend's face, the enraged stepsister screams for agreement while the poor girl squeezes her eyes shut and whimpers helplessly. Storming off down the bright corridor with her flustered companion in tow, Sienna leaves nothing behind but a trailing, non-committal murmur. Meanwhile, walking serenely alone past the tall windows, Lavianje feels a sudden throb lance through her injured wrist and sighs at the inconvenience. Cradling her bruised arm with a wry, unbothered expression, the reincarnated Villainess mutters that this persistent pain is unbelievably annoying. A single narrowed eye lingers in sharp focus, revealing a flicker of genuine calculation beneath her perfectly bored exterior. Lifting her hand into the pale light, she studies the ugly purple bruise ringing her wrist and idly notes she has never once been hurt this badly before. Memories of countless sneering voices wash over her, branding her talentless, incompetent, wicked, and malicious, insults she has weathered 1,000 times without flinching. Pressing a hand to her cheek with a small, tired puff of breath, the ancient soul admits this time they simply went too far and she genuinely got angry. Rolling her sleeve back to inspect the damage, she tilts her head thoughtfully and wonders aloud exactly what she ought to do now. Her sharp golden eye narrows in shrewd calculation as she reasons that compensation is still pending, and healing herself would utterly shatter her carefully built talentless reputation. Striding briskly across the polished tile, she settles on the simplest solution and decides to quietly visit the infirmary and let them heal her instead. Rapping her knuckles gently against the heavy infirmary door, she waits as a low voice from within calmly invites her to come in. Easing the creaking door open, the composed Villainess politely excuses her intrusion as a white-coated figure turns toward her. Adjusting his glasses with elegant, unhurried fingers, the enigmatic school doctor regards his unexpected visitor beneath the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock. Closing her eyes with a soft, knowing chuckle, Lavianje privately confirms that the mysterious man is every bit as strange as she suspected. Recalling their fleeting encounters, she reflects that she occasionally crosses paths with the school doctor at the hallway corners on her way to lunch. Studying his composed, shadowed face, she notes a persistent strange discomfort radiating from him that never once tips over into arrogance, leaving her subtly uneasy. Standing quietly before him, she calmly explains that she seems to have hurt her arm as he mildly observes this is her very first visit. Gesturing invitingly toward the waiting stool, the doctor smoothly instructs her to sit down so he may examine the injury. Taking her slender wrist in his careful hands, he freezes the instant the livid bruise comes into view, murmuring a single sharp, startled note of recognition. Frowning down at the injury, the school doctor coolly declares there's no need to analyze it with magic, since it's plainly a sprain marked by the unmistakable prints of a crushing grip. Studying her carefully composed face, he quietly presses the seemingly unbothered Villainess to explain exactly what happened. Cradling her wrist as he examines it, Lavianje breezily wonders aloud whether this counts as collateral damage from an entanglement of passionate emotions, prompting his flat disbelief at such a trivial-sounding excuse. Raising both glowing hands toward her, the doctor accepts the deflection and announces he'll apply healing magic immediately, only for her to interrupt with a sweet request first. Beaming with a dazzling, flower-strewn smile, she asks him to write her a medical certificate, chirping that a kind person once told her such things are wonderfully useful for insurance purposes. Her expression darkens beneath her lashes as she reasons that the other party is royalty in name at least, and without hard evidence the entire incident could easily be buried. Pen hovering thoughtfully over the page, the doctor mutters something about doing this for someone as the reincarnated Villainess smiles serenely behind him. Signing the completed certificate with an elegant flourish, he dryly remarks that for a woman rumored to be incompetent, she is surprisingly shrewd. Tilting her head with a small, satisfied smile, the ancient soul accepts the backhanded praise without the slightest ripple of offense. Pausing as he wraps her bandaged wrist, the school doctor suddenly asks in a low voice whether she is truly all right with being called incompetent. Smiling faintly in profile, Lavianje answers with absolute, unbothered calm that it doesn't particularly bother her in the least. Explaining her philosophy through the sunlit infirmary window, She notes that if being seen as incompetent means being treated lightly, then simply keeping her distance from such people is more than enough. Meeting his gaze with a wry, knowing smile, she declares that rather than surrounding herself with people she can never feel at ease around, solitude is infinitely more peaceful. Turning his face away in quiet contemplation, the enigmatic doctor murmurs a low, weighted acknowledgement. Watching him regard her like some kind of pitiful little creature, Lavianje bristles internally while he calmly insists that he genuinely means it. Blinking with round, startled eyes, the ancient soul freezes as he flatly announces the treatment is finished. Flexing her freshly healed wrist in mild wonder, she remarks that she was properly treated and expresses relief that he isn't the sort of man to act on prejudice against a talentless incompetent. Extending the finished certificate toward her, the doctor warns that sudden movements or heavy lifting will cause a relapse and instructs her to take it easy for the remainder of the day. Accepting the precious document with a radiant, genuine smile, the reincarnated Villainess offers him her heartfelt thanks. Turning to leave the quiet infirmary, she departs while the mysterious school doctor watches her retreating figure with an unreadable, lingering stare. Pressing a hand to his mouth in quiet astonishment, the mysterious school doctor privately marvels that the talentless girl is capable of making such an expression. Stepping back into the sunlit corridor with the certificate in hand, the reincarnated Villainess declares her business here thoroughly finished. Skipping lightly down the hallway with a musical note trailing behind her, she smiles and notes she secured the medical certificate properly, an ironclad piece of insurance for whatever comes next. Meanwhile, in the vast library, Mikhail calmly slides a book back onto the towering shelf, utterly unaware of the storm barreling toward him. Startled by a violent pounding at the door, the knight in training turns sharply toward the sudden commotion. Bursting into the library with her bewildered friend trailing behind, Sienna screams for her big brother and desperately begs him to stop their wicked stepsister. Chasing after his retreating form between the endless bookshelves, the tearful stepsister shrieks for him to listen while Mikhail coolly asks why she is behaving so hysterically. Clenching her fists with wide, indignant eyes, Sienna announces that their fearless stepsister publicly demanded compensation from Lord Schwa in front of absolutely everyone. Whirling around with a stunned, disbelieving grimace, Mikhail realizes with a jolt that something entirely different had provoked the second prince's rage. Spreading her arms in a theatrical display of anguish, the scheming stepsister insists she earnestly pleaded for the demand to be withdrawn, purely so Lavianje might reconsider her own precarious position. Sniffling delicately into her fingers, she laments that their heartless stepsister flatly refused to retract the compensation claim. Clutching desperately at his sleeve, Sienna wails that the Roble family's reputation will be utterly ruined at this rate and begs her brother to scold their stepsister properly. A slow, poisonous smile curls across her hidden face as she reflects that her brother already dislikes their stepsister, and she wants nothing more than for him to hate her more and more. Sinking to her knees in radiant, imagined triumph, the scheming stepsister envisions Laviange's position collapsing until it is only a matter of time before she is kicked out of the house entirely. Staring straight ahead with narrowed, thunderous eyes, Mikhail's expression darkens into something cold and severe. Hiding her gleeful smile behind her hand, Sienna's heart races with dark anticipation as she gloats that even her brother is angry now, and that the talentless incompetent should finally learn her place. Elsewhere in the sunlit hall, Lavianje strolls along reading her precious certificate with a small, entirely unbothered smile. Framed by a sprawling tangle of thorned roses, the scheming stepsister presses both hands to her face, her cold eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. Rounding on the sobbing girl with sharp suspicion, Mikhail demands to know what compensation from the second prince could possibly mean, and whether her companion actually witnessed the confrontation. Trembling and tearful, the frightened friend stammers a shaky confirmation, confessing she was utterly terrified of the older stepsister who spoke so harshly. Clutching at her chest with furious, glistening eyes, the scheming stepsister wails that she only wants to remain engaged to Lord Schwa, deliberately performing her anguish to seize every ounce of attention. Rolling his eyes at her theatrical shrieking about Lord Schwa's offense and the Roble family's ruined reputation, Mikhail responds with nothing but weary, pointed silence. Turning his sharp gaze toward the other girl, the knight in training asks whether Miss Ella, who accompanied Sienna, actually witnessed the entire confrontation firsthand. Clasping her hands tightly against her chest, the anxious classmate stammers helplessly, visibly torn between the truth and the fury she knows awaits her. A single venomous eye flashes toward Ella from behind a curtain of hair, silently commanding her obedience with pure, chilling menace. Flinching violently under that glare, the terrified girl trembles as the unspoken threat crashes over her. Steeling herself with a shaky breath, Ella confirms that compensation was indeed demanded, then bravely begins to add that the circumstances were entirely different. Cutting her off with a blood-curdling shriek, Sienna's face contorts into a monstrous mask as she screams at her brother to stop and demands to know what he intends to say. Shoving desperately at Mikhail's back, the frantic stepsister insists their wicked stepsister has already gone home for the day. Pushing him bodily toward the door, she demands he hurry and force Lavianje to retract her words and apologize immediately. Cheek pressed against his back in shameless manipulation, she insists that matters like these absolutely must be dealt with without a moment's delay. Releasing a long, exhausted sigh, the knight-in-training relents and agrees that he will go ask Lavianje directly. Clasping her hands with a smug, triumphant little smile, the scheming stepsister savors her apparent victory. Glancing back over his shoulder with piercing, unimpressed eyes, Mikhail coldly warns her not to assume he will remain oblivious forever. Turning fully toward her with a hard, cutting stare, he bluntly informs her that there are things about her own words and behavior she urgently needs to change. Blinking in blank, uncomprehending shock, Sienna freezes as the accusation lands somewhere she never expected. Tears welling in her wide, disbelieving eyes, the stepsister reels in outrage, demanding to know why on earth she is suddenly the one being blamed. Striding briskly toward the exit, Mikhail declares that regardless of anything else, they will speak with Lavianje first. Slamming her palm against the closing door, Sienna screams after her departing brother in desperate, shrill protest. Grinding her teeth behind a trembling fist, the scheming stepsister snarls that Lavianje is the one who should change, vowing with blazing hatred to absolutely crush that insufferable eyesore of a woman. Sipping tea outside her beloved log house, Lavianje idly wonders how she should spend the incoming compensation money, noting she could repair and reinforce the broken door. Grinning wickedly atop a glittering mountain of gold bars and coins, the ancient soul decides it might be wisest to simply hoard the fortune for an emergency. A sudden knock cuts through the quiet, instantly snapping the reincarnated Villainess out of her blissful daydream. Blinking in mild surprise, Lavianje muses that visitors other than Sienna are exceedingly rare and idly wonders who could possibly be calling. A flat, unmistakable voice answers through the heavy wooden door, curtly announcing that it is him. Sipping her tea without a trace of concern, she coolly asks which me exactly is addressing her, earning an irritated click of the tongue as he identifies himself as her brother, Mikhail Roble. Her expression darkens instantly as she realizes he has never once set foot here before, and she immediately suspects Sienna poisoned his ear. Calling out that the door is already open, she listens to the heavy wood groan wide on its ruined hinges. Mikhail looms in the doorway radiating a thundercloud of pure displeasure, while the utterly unbothered Villainess cheerfully observes how extremely sour he looks. She recalls that her biological brother, 2 years her senior, is about to turn 19 and is expected to graduate the Royal Academy come spring. Smiling faintly to herself, she acknowledges without a shred of envy that her brother ranks among the genuinely exceptional ones. Raised under merciless discipline as the ducal heir, he became relentlessly responsible, and she calmly accepts that he cannot possibly tolerate someone as freely careless as her. She wryly reflects that her brother is precisely the cool-type love interest from an otome game, his cold attitude only rendering him more picturesque, and admits he is the very reason she now lives in this log house. Today, however, the exhausted centenarian soul confesses she would much rather relax than admire pretty visuals, and privately wishes whoever it is would leave immediately. Glancing toward her fluffy sacred beast hiding in the shadows, Lavianje mourns that she desperately wants to cuddle Casjon, who stubbornly refuses to emerge while anyone else is present. Reading the damning timing perfectly, she concludes he has absolutely heard Sienna's version of the Academy incident and resolves to dispatch this conversation as swiftly as humanly possible. Settling calmly at her tea table, she politely asks what brings her brother here, only for Mikhail to ignore her entirely and demand why the door isn't locked. Beaming with radiant, infuriating sweetness, she cheerfully points out that the door was already broken and therefore hardly her fault. Mikhail's sharp gaze narrows dangerously as he demands to know who broke it, incredulously asking whether a burglar had actually broken into her home. Standing rigid above her quiet table, the ducal heir waits for an answer, the unlocked door hanging between them like an accusation neither sibling has yet explained. Beaming with radiant, infuriating sweetness, the Villainess cheerfully points out that the door was already broken and therefore hardly her fault. Mikhail's sharp gaze narrows dangerously as he demands to know who broke it, incredulously asking whether a burglar had truly broken in. Waving off his alarm with a serene smile, she airily explains that someone had been slamming the door open and shut rather violently the other day until it finally gave way. Adding that the ancient thing has been opened and closed countless times and is likely simply aging, she watches her brother's feet still as he flatly asks if she means Sienna. Ignoring the trap entirely, Mikhail redirects with cold precision and demands to know why she is living out here in the first place, leaving the villainess blinking in genuine bewilderment. Tapping her chin in innocent confusion, she calmly reminds him that she was ordered to live separately as punishment for making their stepsister cry, and asks whether he truly wasn't informed. Fanning herself lazily, she adds that it happened right after their stepsister entered the picture, prompting a strangled command from her brother to wait. Cold sweat breaks across Mikhail's forehead as he presses a hand to his face and desperately calculates exactly how many years have passed since that day. Whirling on her in absolute horror, the ducal heir grabs at his collar and demands to know whether that punishment is somehow still in effect. Tilting her head with mild, sweet-faced curiosity, the ancient soul serenely confirms it and wonders aloud why he looks so shocked by something he himself said. The memory surfaces of their shrieking mother declaring that Lavianje would remain out here until one of them was forgiven, with a young Mikhail standing silently behind her. Grimacing at the ceiling, he bitterly demands why she never raised this at the dinner party, muttering that she should have simply refused instead of being so stubbornly silent. Watching his frustration with flat, unimpressed eyes, the reincarnated villainess quietly notes that he is doing it again. His glare sharpens to a knife's edge as he coldly asks whether she is trying to pin the blame on him. Smiling with devastating, honeyed innocence, she tilts her head and asks whether she has ever once brought up anything about her dear brother. Pressing a hand to his forehead in mounting exasperation, Mikhail throws her own words back and demands to know if she means it is somehow his fault. Watching him seethe with detached puzzlement, she assures him she isn't bothered in the slightest and privately wonders why on earth he is being so aggressive about it. A blinding revelation detonates across her face as the 100-year-old soul triumphantly concludes that her brother must be going through a rebellious phase. Nodding sagely with sparkling eyes while a thoroughly confused Mikhail stares, she declares that indulging young people's conversations is simply the sacred duty of an old lady on the inside. Beaming at the bewildered heir with grandmotherly delight, she privately savors this cute stage of growth, utterly unaware of how completely she has misread him. Beaming with saintly reassurance, the ancient soul consoles her brother that none of this is his fault since it's merely hormones, sending the utterly baffled heir into a spluttering demand for what hormones even are. Realizing far too late that such knowledge simply doesn't exist in this world, the reincarnated villainess quietly bites her tongue. She privately recalls the tidy explanation that puberty's surging hormones breed aggression, a biological instinct designed to stop humans from viewing blood relatives as romantic targets. Cupping her flushed cheeks with sparkling delight, she airily waves the matter aside and gushes that she simply felt happy watching her dear brother grow up so very healthily. Sweat beads down Mikhail's face as he stands frozen beneath the weight of her beaming, maternal approval. His expression curdles into visible dread as he inwardly recoils from that lukewarm gaze, likening it to a grandmother fondly surveying a horde of grandchildren. Panic flashes through the 100-year-old soul as the word grandmother stabs at her twice over, and she frantically wonders whether he has somehow deduced her true identity. Clearing her throat and teasing that such stares might genuinely wound her, the composed villainess smoothly pivots and asks what business brought him here. Pressing a hand to his temple, Mikhail concedes the point and steels himself to finally state his purpose. His voice drops low and serious as he speaks her name aloud, the intimacy of it landing far heavier than any insult. Fixing her with a grim, searching stare, the ducal heir demands to know whether she truly extracted compensation from the second prince. Smiling knowingly as she realizes this was the entire point of his visit, Lavianje confirms it without a flicker of shame. His eyes narrow to razor slits as he presses her with a single, weighted question, why? Blinking with maddening innocence, she counters that she was injured, so surely the answer is perfectly obvious. She calmly explains that she's already been healed, but since her arm was wrenched she requested compensation, prompting Mikhail to warn that the furious second prince may annul the engagement outright. Turning her face aside with a slow, cutting smile, the villainess simply asks whether that possibility bothers him. Something snaps in the composed air as he explodes, roaring that this is unquestionably a problem and demanding she consider her own precarious position. Turning away with rigid shoulders, he insists her engagement to the second prince is something she genuinely needs and that worsening her reputation is absolutely unacceptable. Rounding on her with raw, uncharacteristic heat, he orders her to think before acting and to bring any complaints to him first instead of hurling them at royalty. Her smile sharpens into something exquisitely lethal as she sweetly observes that they aren't exactly on speaking terms about such matters, making his sudden fury over a subject they never discuss quite thoroughly unreasonable. Grinding out a bitter curse under his breath, the cornered heir falls into a heavy, wordless silence. Tittering behind her hand with insufferable poise, the villainess gently chides him that such coarse language is deeply improper for a nobleman. Folding her hands demurely, she marvels that somewhere along the way she has ended up being lectured by her own younger-hearted brother. A memory surfaces of the small, watchful stepsister arriving in their household precisely when everything between the siblings had already grown distant. She recalls the emotional gulf between herself and Mikhail widening all at once after that day, the two of them passing each other in silent corridors. Even as her brother began looking at her with visible reluctance more and more often, the ancient soul had simply accepted it as the natural way of nobles. Her expression darkens as she reflects that her engagement is now nothing but a hollow lie, and that failing to take decisive action back then only worsened everything. Her eyes sharpen to knife points beneath her lashes as she calculates that her brother's gathered information is dangerously incomplete, which means this is indeed exactly what she suspected. Turning the conversation with surgical precision, she sweetly asks from whom, exactly, he heard about the compensation fee. Glancing away with a grimace, Mikhail admits it came from Sienna, who claimed Lavianje was on course to disgrace the Roire family's honor. Lowering her lashes with a slow, knowing smile, the villainess murmurs that Sienna being the source makes perfect sense. Bristling at her tone, he defensively adds that he naturally verified the account with others who had been standing nearby. Turning his back to her entirely, the ducal heir coldly pronounces that she made a wrong decision entirely on her own. He insists that any discomfort should have been brought to their father the duke or to himself as the next heir, reminding her he has always told her to act with the awareness of a noble lady. His composure finally detonates as he whirls and roars that she lacks the education befitting a duke's daughter, which is precisely why she makes poor decisions and is universally dismissed as talentless and incompetent. Silence falls as the villainess simply lowers her gaze, privately and immovably certain that her judgment is not wrong. She calmly reflects that being hurt by such words costs her nothing, because living as talentless and incompetent was a choice she made deliberately and has never once regretted. Concluding there is absolutely no point continuing this circular conversation, she decides to end it swiftly and pleasantly praises him with a honeyed "as expected of you, brother." Chuckling brightly as she thanks him for such an insightful discussion, she moves to change the subject entirely, prompting the flabbergasted heir to demand why she's laughing and whether she's making a fool of him. Blinking up at his furious, wide-eyed face with saintly innocence, the 100-year-old soul serenely wonders aloud whether her dear brother is simply having another rebellious phase. Sipping placidly beside her untouched teacup, the villainess urges her brother to calm down and gently suggests the entire matter is merely his paranoia, drawing a strangled cry of disbelief. Tapping her chin with maddening leisure, she pivots to ask whether he doesn't get terribly thirsty from being angry all of the time. Something behind Mikhail's eyes finally snaps as his shadowed face contorts and his hand lifts. Roaring at her not to mess with him, the enraged heir swings and strikes his sister clean across the face. A pained grunt escapes her as the sheer force of the blow sends the slight girl crashing violently to the floorboards. Frozen in shock with a hand pressed to his chest, Mikhail stares down at the sprawled figure while the villainess merely gazes back with an unreadable, faintly amused expression. Cold, sickening horror crawls across the ducal heir as he stands motionless above the crumpled shape of his own sister. Trembling fingers rise to his mouth as a small, broken sound escapes him and the full weight of what he has done lands. Propped weakly on one arm, the villainess softly admits she never meant to mock him and that being struck genuinely surprised her, while a stabbing pain screams through her arm and she privately suspects it may be broken. Beckoning to the paralyzed heir, she quietly addresses him as her older brother. Extending a shaking hand from the floor, she simply asks him to please help her up. Rushing to her side and gripping her arm, Mikhail's face drains of all color as he chokes out a horrified realization about the state of it. Gathering his sister up into his arms in a single desperate motion, the stricken heir apologizes over and over, her name torn raw from his throat. Carrying her carefully into her own bedroom, he glances around the unfamiliar room with visible awkwardness before setting her gently down. Kneeling before the bed, Mikhail quietly apologizes for entering her bedroom without permission and asks to see her injured arm. A sharp hiss of pain slips through her teeth as his fingers carefully probe the swollen limb. His face twists with raw, unguarded guilt as he murmurs an apology for hurting her. Warm healing light blooms beneath his palm as he gently tells her she doesn't need to hold back her voice if it hurts. Radiant magic floods the quiet room as the ducal heir cradles her arm with painstaking tenderness, mending what his own fury broke. Watching her brother work with a soft, complicated expression, the villainess studies the bowed head of the boy who has never once knelt before her until now. Even though she was slapped in a burst of raw fury, the ancient soul quietly notes that her stinging cheek barely aches at all. Concluding she must have struck a bad spot when she crashed to the floor, Lavianje privately observes that her brother clearly held back, at least a little. Watching the bowed golden head with faint bemusement, she feels the warm hum of healing magic pour into her shattered arm as the fracture knits itself whole. Testing the mended limb at his tense request, the talentless duchess's daughter flexes her fingers and calmly confirms there is absolutely no problem. Touching her tender face, Mikhail mutters that only her bruised cheek remains, prompting a flat, unimpressed stare from the century-old girl. Soft light blooms beneath his careful palm as the swelling fades completely from her pale skin under his gentle, deliberate touch. Straightening slowly, the ducal heir withdraws his glowing hand, his stiff expression betraying nothing of the storm raging beneath it. Standing over her in the quiet log house, he hesitates with an outstretched hand hovering uncertainly above her long silver hair. Kneeling before the bed where she sits, Mikhail anxiously asks if anything still hurts anywhere, and Lavianje serenely assures him she is perfectly fine. His clenched fist trembles against his knee as a hoarse, broken apology finally escapes the throat of the brother who never bends. Turning toward him with a soft, coaxing voice, the reincarnated villainess gently calls him brother and tells him she does not want him wearing such a face. Reaching out to cradle his cheek, a bewildered Mikhail asks in a small voice exactly what kind of face he is even making right now. Holding his stricken gaze with ancient tenderness, she tells the proud knight in training that he looks as though he is about to burst into tears. Absorbing her words with a stunned murmur, Mikhail touches his own face and quietly breathes that he finally sees. Confessing awkwardly that he only meant to check on the matter with the prince, the ducal heir admits he got emotional and shamefully resorted to violence. Delight blooms across her flushed face as Lavianje presses her hands together and giggles, utterly enchanted by her little brother's grumbling honesty. Frozen in absolute shock, Mikhail stares at her radiant expression and realizes this unguarded joy is how his sister truly smiles. Catching herself mid-swoon, the century-old grandmother clears her throat and innocently wonders whether that particular smile came out different from usual. Composure restored, Mikhail returns to his original question through the sunlit window, demanding to know why she refuses a proper education and simply accepts being branded talentless and incompetent. Tilting her head with serene, practiced innocence, the notorious villainess mildly counters that surely it is simply because she is talentless and incompetent. Cutting through her deflection without hesitation, Mikhail flatly declares that it absolutely is not true. Recalling her flawless bearing at every gathering, he insists she may not have noticed, but her manners and etiquette are unfailingly, absolutely perfect. Still kneeling before the bed, the ducal heir quietly asks whether he himself has ever once called her talentless and incompetent. A stunned silence stretches between them as the ancient soul stares at her brother, genuinely caught off guard for the very first time. Admitting the harsh truth with grim composure, Mikhail confesses that he did indeed order her to acquire knowledge and proper education. His voice cracks into a raw shout as he fiercely declares that even if the entire world brands her incompetent, he never once did. Frozen in dawning realization, Lavianje slowly grasps that perhaps her cold-eyed brother never actually mocked her himself. Confessing that he feels none of the burning anger toward her that he directed at the second prince, Mikhail frustratedly complains that her sheer opacity makes his concern impossible to convey, demanding she tell him things first. Even when he raised his hand against her, the guilt-stricken knight in training regretted it instantly, his horrified eyes wide with self-loathing. Understanding blooms softly across her face as the reincarnated villainess quietly admits she did sense at least some genuine consideration buried in his harshness. Bowing his head with clenched fists, Mikhail confesses he had always privately regarded his difficult little sister as a thoroughly lovable person. Speaking her name with unfamiliar gentleness, The ducal heir firmly states that he does not believe she lacks ability or talent in the slightest. His trembling hands hover between them as he quietly begs to know her true, unvarnished feelings. Clasping her hands within his own, Mikhail earnestly declares that he wants to speak with the real Lavianje at last. Her faint, wistful smile falters as something ancient and guarded flickers behind the century-old girl's shining eyes. Slipping her hands free of his grip, she gently informs the stunned heir that the relationship between herself and this family is already utterly broken. Struck speechless, Mikhail can only stare at her with a stricken, wordless expression. Waving him off with a weary, dismissive hand, the exiled duchess's daughter calmly announces that restoration no longer interests her and everything is far too late now. Refusing to retreat, Mikhail presses relentlessly through the sunlit window, insisting that running from her upbringing was never true escape and demanding to know whether she really thinks this is enough. Pressing his point with grim conviction, the ducal heir demands whether she truly believes she can escape after being raised as a noble lady. A slow, razor-edged smile curves her lips as Lavianje gestures at the bare log walls, sweetly asking if he really thinks she was raised and treated like a noble lady after seeing this room. Every word dies in Mikhail's throat as he takes in the crude timber, the plain door, and the single lonely chair for the very first time. Turning her back to him, the exiled duchess's daughter calmly asks whether he can even imagine how she goes to school, spends her days, returns home, or passes the hours until sleep. Bowing his head under the crushing weight of his own ignorance, the knight in training can only whisper a hollow, defeated apology. Softening slightly, the ancient soul admits that even so, she could always faintly feel that he was genuinely concerned about her. Observing his hunched, guilt-ridden form with warm amusement, she remarks that even now he simply apologizes and begs forgiveness, finding his clumsy sincerity quite endearing. A wicked, knowing smile spreads across her shadowed face as she declares that this is precisely why she is still here. Facing him squarely across the room, Lavianje coolly states that as a noble lady she is engaged to the second prince and follows along without objection, despite some genuinely absurd and exaggerated arguments. Standing before the bed with eyes closed, the century-old girl quietly reminds him that until today she endured absolutely everything and swallowed every insult without complaint. Extending a crisp document toward her kneeling brother, she watches Mikhail's face drain of color as he asks in disbelief whether this is a medical report. Reeling in horror, the ducal heir recalls Sienna swearing the incident was exaggerated, realizing that none of this would have happened if the prince had not deliberately twisted his sister's arm. Clutching the damning certificate against his face, Mikhail's voice breaks completely as he pours out a raw, trembling apology for such a thing ever occurring. Lifting his head with newfound clarity, the shaken heir concedes that under these circumstances it is entirely understandable that she can no longer accept any of it. Kneeling before her once more, Mikhail carefully notes that engagement to the royal family is the envy of countless noble daughters, and asks whether she truly wishes to annul it without a shred of regret. Closing her eyes with a serene smile, the reincarnated Villainess clarifies that as a daughter of the Roble family, she simply does not actively seek to annul it. Weighing the political landscape with a century of accumulated wisdom, she notes that considering the ducal houses, the kingdom's factions, and the balance of power between nations, anyone could understand her position. Studying his sister with dawning respect, Mikhail quietly admits that he had utterly misjudged her capabilities as a duchess until this very moment. Blinking up at him with wide, guileless eyes, the ancient soul is then asked what she personally, honestly wants for herself. Beaming with radiant, terrifying cheer, Lavianje raises one finger and merrily announces that she would love to bury her fiancé in the dark and secure a direct annulment, leaving Mikhail sweating at how extreme that truly was. A cold, glittering smile spreads across her face as the ancient soul declares that in her life the second prince is nothing but an obstacle utterly unworthy of any emotional investment. Contemplating the ornate engagement ring, she coolly states she cannot fathom why she, the legitimate heir of the Roble family, must be the one shackled to the second prince. Recalling the sickeningly happy pair, she observes that her scheming stepsister and his affair partners suit each other perfectly in both personality and mutual affection. Cradling a bouquet of dark roses, the notorious Villainess dryly notes that she is talentless and incompetent, unable to even use magic properly, yet the engagement stubbornly refuses to dissolve despite his abysmal reputation. Standing over her kneeling brother, she concludes that personally, she still does not wish to annul the arrangement just yet. Pressing a crimson rose to her lips, the reincarnated Villainess explains that even as a talentless, powerless noblewoman, Her blood and her position still retain considerable utility. Turning with a razor-sharp smile against a field of spider lilies, she muses that as long as she cannot predict her treatment after the annulment, it would surely be far safer to simply leave everything exactly as it is. Realization detonates across Mikhail's face as he stares at her retreating figure, breathlessly demanding whether she has only been pretending to be talentless and incompetent this entire time. Standing serene before the log wall with hands folded, the century-old girl receives her brother's stunned accusation in absolute, unreadable silence. Recalling that he came only to hear her side after Sienna's tale, the ducal heir realizes a certain thought seized him and burst out before he could stop it. A low, wicked chuckle escapes her lips as the ancient villainess purrs that whether she is pretending or not makes no difference whatsoever. Declaring she has never once claimed to be either incompetent or talented, she coolly informs him that she simply acts as she pleases and lives as she wishes, then asks who exactly is viewing life through rose-colored glasses now. Struck by the brutal accuracy of her words, Mikhail bitterly concedes that they themselves were the ones who arbitrarily invented the image of Lavianje. Rising to his feet with fresh resolve, the ducal heir announces that he will personally speak to their father about her engagement once again. Clasping her hands with a delighted, closed-eyed smile, the notorious villainess sweetly tells him she would be very happy indeed if he did that. Pausing beside her at the doorway, Mikhail casts a long, conflicted glance at his sister's slender frame. Studying the vast gulf between their physiques, the guilt-stricken knight silently berates himself that he should never, ever have resorted to violence. Staring down at his own open palm, he clearly sees now that the storm has passed just how utterly foolish his actions truly were. His fist clenches tight and trembling as another raw, aching apology falls from his lips. Bowing his golden head in genuine remorse, the ducal heir confesses he misjudged her all along and kept lashing out, when simply talking to her properly would have revealed what she truly felt. Grimacing under the crushing weight of his own shame, Mikhail confesses that even after realizing the truth, his stubborn pride blocked him from correcting himself immediately. His fist clenches white-knuckled at his side as he chokes out one final apology for raising his hand in a fit of raw emotion. Raising a delicate finger, the reincarnated villainess calmly cuts him off with a single, pointed address to her brother. Fixing him with a flat, ancient stare, she coolly informs the groveling heir that apologizing too much starts to feel utterly insincere. Recoiling with a pained groan as she pokes his cheek, Mikhail sheepishly concedes the point and immediately apologizes for apologizing. Blinking up at him with wide, guileless eyes, the century-old girl watches him fluster over whether he truly did something that terrible and how on earth he should make it up to her. Seizing the opening with gleeful precision, she raises a triumphant finger and demands that her dear brother pay proper compensation from his personal assets, prompting his desperate promise to give as much as needed. Winking with dazzling, predatory charm, the notorious villainess clarifies that she wants payment in kind rather than money, leaving the bewildered heir demanding to know exactly what she wants. Her merciless gaze settles on the weathered log house as she names her price: full repairs for this crumbling detached residence. Bewildered, Mikhail suggests she simply return to the mansion instead, only for Lavianje to flatly refuse, declaring it far too late and this humble place genuinely relaxing. Reeling internally at her answer, the ducal heir cannot fathom how this rustic cabin could possibly be comfortable when the grand mansion is objectively superior in every way. Closing her eyes with a beatific, utterly content smile, the ancient soul serenely insists that he make absolutely certain to repair it properly. Flustered into immediate surrender, Mikhail hastily promises full repairs and adds that she should tell him about any furniture she would like added. Clasping her hands together with a delighted little chuckle, the talentless villainess purrs that she will happily take him up on that generous offer. Reeling off her demands with cheerful precision, she requests a pure white three-seater sofa with fabric upholstery, protection and anti-theft magic on the property, and formal notification to every single person at the mansion. A sharp, sickening pang lances through Mikhail's chest as he registers what protection and anti-theft magic implies about incidents that must have already happened here. Insisting she not hesitate to ask for anything else, the ducal heir listens as his sister airily replies that she truly does not want much beyond the repairs she mentioned earlier. Blood drains from his face in horror as she casually specifies the leaking roof and the broken door lock, leaving him to hoarsely repeat the words back in disbelief. Standing serenely amid the ruin with folded hands, Lavianje smiles gently while her brother reels at the realization that he let his own little sister live in a place like this. Turning away in profound self-loathing, The ducal heir bitterly admits that he truly, utterly despises himself for it. Pressing a hand to her cheek with an airy little sigh, the century-old girl casually explains that the roof leaks were already repaired once by Garufi-san, who serves as the royal family's shadow, though a brand new spot recently started dripping. His pupils shrinking to pinpricks in the suffocating black, the ducal heir freezes as that single devastating word detonates inside his skull. Steam visibly erupting from his scrambled head, Mikhail numbly mutters that he feels like he just heard something he was absolutely never supposed to hear, while Lavianje innocently tilts her head and repeats the word shadow. Cheerfully gesturing toward the faceless figure among the flowers, the reincarnated Villainess breezily introduces Garufi-san, the royal family's secret shadow, 31 years old, formerly spying from the ceilings, dressing and speaking femininely, and currently enjoying the single aristocratic life. Beaming with sparkling delight, she recounts how the shadow peeks in regularly and then leaves, occasionally fixing the log house from the ceiling along the way, until those repair skills reached a fully professional level. Clasping her hands together with radiant sparkles blooming around her, the talentless Villainess glows while her utterly hollowed-out brother manages only a dead, flat acknowledgement. Clutching his skull as swirling despair spirals around him, Mikhail internally screams about whether revealing names and personal information to a surveillance target is remotely acceptable, why she's getting along so absurdly well with the shadow, and how Garufi frankly just sounds like a common peeping Tom. Shattering his spiral entirely, he desperately bellows that she is a young lady of marriageable age and should be far, far more concerned about being watched, while she simply smiles serenely with her eyes closed. Dragging a hand down his exhausted face with a long, defeated exhale, the ducal heir surrenders the argument and moves on. Standing firmly before her on the patterned carpet, he declares that he now fully understands the current situation, and that she will therefore be returning to her original room from this moment forward. Pressing a delicate hand to her lips with a sweetly evasive smile, the century-old girl smoothly counters that her mother and Sienna would be terribly preoccupied thinking about such a matter. Sparkling with practiced innocence, she dodges beautifully, while Mikhail grimly recognizes that if he doesn't call her out immediately, she will absolutely slip away with it. Vivid images of his sneering mother and glaring stepsister flare behind him as the ducal heir grimly concedes that sending Lavianje back into that poisonous environment would indeed be a disaster. Undeterred, Mikhail firmly announces there is an empty room on the floor of his own quarters and orders her to use it from now on, while she stares up at him in flat disbelief. Blinking slowly with her fingers at her lips, the reincarnated Villainess can only manage a bewildered little oh my, oh my. Gazing up at the grand estate, he acknowledges her concern isn't unreasonable, but explains the wing he resides in has been used for generations by those inheriting the estate. Fixing her with a level, unyielding stare, the knight in training clarifies that his room sits in an entirely different wing from his mother's and Sienna's, and that the servants working there answer exclusively to him. He coolly adds that those servants exist completely outside his mother's control and have therefore been properly educated. Extending his hand toward the log walls, Mikhail confirms he will also lay protection and anti-crime magic over that room, prompting Lavianje to murmur how extravagant it all is and concede that she might as well accept if he insists. Turning toward the window and the fading afternoon sky, the century-old girl softly observes that it has gotten quite late, hasn't it? Standing together on the patterned carpet, the ducal heir quietly agrees, while Lavianje notes they have preparations for tomorrow, so it's about time he left. Turning back with a suddenly serious expression, Mikhail remembers that tomorrow is joint training with their classmates and asks what exactly she will be in charge of. Framed together in the log house window, the century-old girl casually replies that she supposes she'll handle camp preparations and cooking, while her brother takes strategy and combat. Glancing sideways with a low murmur, the knight in training confirms it with a single quiet word. Standing stiffly in the doorway of the little log house, the two siblings face each other in a fragile, unfamiliar silence. His profile hardening with genuine concern, Mikhail warns her that this year's magical beasts are ranked considerably stronger than last year's. Leaning against the doorframe with a soft, knowing smile, the talentless Villainess listens as he orders her to immediately retreat to the senior students if anything dangerous happens, and calmly answers that she understands. Gazing down at her with startlingly gentle eyes, the ducal heir quietly tells his little sister to get some rest. Beaming brightly at the threshold, Lavianje answers yes and bids her brother a warm good night before the door closes between them. Walking away into the dark, Mikhail bitterly reflects that even if he tries to let himself relax like this, it is only temporary, because the role he must play for the family is one of pure devotion, one he crafted entirely himself. Staring down at the floorboards, he resolves to stop viewing everything through his tinted glasses and seeing only what he wants to see, vowing to finally learn to hold his emotions back even a little. A tiny bird chirps on a leafy branch outside the log house as morning light floods the windows and the weather turns beautifully clear again. Sipping her tea beside a slice of cake, the reincarnated Villainess marvels that she never expected such words from her brother yesterday, his confession that his pride blocked him from correcting himself, and his offer of the empty room above his own. Pressing a fork to her lips with sparkles bursting around her, the century-old girl gleefully congratulates herself, thrilled that it seems she'll be getting separate training too. Freezing mid-bite as a sharp knock rattles the door, she calls out to ask who it is, and blinks in surprise when the answer comes back that it's Mikhail. Standing in the bright morning doorway with one hand on the frame, the ducal heir stiffly excuses himself for the intrusion. Stepping inside the airy log house, he offers an awkward good morning and asks how her arm is and whether she slept well, prompting a bewildered good morning in return. Turning in her chair with a small, amused smile, Lavianje assures him that both her arm and her sleep are perfectly fine, then politely asks how he fared. Softening visibly, the knight in training says he's glad to hear it and admits that he slept well himself. Covering her mouth with both hands as her eyes go wide, the century-old girl marvels at how long it has been since she last exchanged a morning greeting, and realizes this is her very first early morning surprise visit from anyone other than Sienna. Blinking down at the plated sandwiches and soup, the ducal heir suddenly realizes he interrupted her breakfast and awkwardly apologizes for disturbing her. Folding her hands with a mild smile, the century-old girl asks whether he has eaten yet, and Mikhail stiffly admits that no, not yet. Tilting his head in blank confusion, he repeats the words homemade cooking, and she cheerfully confirms that's right. Presenting the glittering spread with quiet pride, the talentless Villainess explains their spiced meat sandwiches with green bean and egg soup, and offers to prepare the same dish immediately if he'd care to join her. Freezing solid as his stomach growls audibly through the log house, Mikhail stammers the words spiced sandwiches and haltingly asks whether that's really okay, while she beams that of course it is. Shattering the entire tender moment, the door bursts violently open as the scheming stepsister comes tumbling and shrieking for her big brother to please wait. Slowly closing his eyes, the ducal heir exhales one long, deeply weary breath. Glancing over at the disheveled intruder, the reincarnated Villainess remarks how quite rare it is for Sienna to appear in such an unkempt state, and mildly calls it unusual. Pressing her hands to her lips with wide, innocently blinking eyes, the century-old girl politely asks why on earth her stepsister is in such a tremendous hurry. Turning slowly with a cold, level stare, Mikhail addresses Sienna directly and asks whether she always barges into Laviange's place like this. Narrating dryly that it became a noisy morning the instant her stepsister arrived, Lavianje watches Sienna wail from the doorway that instead of only listening to her older sister's story, he should listen to her too. Cutting through the noise with a single flat utterance of her name, the knight in training makes the scheming stepsister flinch and stiffen mid-breath. Exploding into furious tears, Sienna jabs an accusing finger and shrieks that her big sister is so cruel, screaming that in the end Lavianje is simply defending herself in front of their brother. Smiling serenely with half-lidded eyes, the talentless Villainess coolly assures her that it's all just a misunderstanding and urges her to please calm down. Whirling on him with fresh outrage, Sienna screams at Lavianje not to dodge the issue, and Mikhail sharply barks her name to cut the tantrum short. Dragging a hand down his aching face, the exhausted ducal heir states that he and Lavianje have joint training today, and orders his stepsister to go now, they'll talk after he returns. Standing frozen in the doorway with a wounded expression, the scheming stepsister murmurs a hollow understood before the door quietly clicks shut behind her. Eyes going enormous with sparkling astonishment, the century-old girl marvels that this is the very first time she's heard Sienna close a door quietly, and declares herself utterly surprised. Rubbing his temple with a grimace, Mikhail apologizes that trouble followed him here the moment he decided to visit her place, while Lavianje waves it off and says it's fine since she's used to it. Freezing at those 3 words, the ducal heir goes pale with a cold sweat, grimly registering that being used to it means Sienna is always like that. Setting a fresh place at the little table with a soft giggle, the talentless Villainess tells him not to worry about it and cheerfully announces she'll prepare his breakfast right now, drawing a quiet thank you from her flustered brother. 2 neat plates of spiced meat sandwiches sit gleaming side by side, garnished and waiting. Seated across from one another over steaming cups, The siblings share a morning slightly different from the usual as a carriage wheel rolls into view outside. Handing her down from the carriage with careful courtesy, the ducal heir escorts his sister as they head to the academy together for the very first time. Standing before the towering spires and endless arcades, the reincarnated Villainess gazes up at the Royal Academy in the clear morning light. Narrating coolly, she explains that here, starting with royalty and nobles, even commoners may enroll provided they pay a certain amount in taxes. She notes that the academy offers various departments such as business administration and witchcraft, where students study diligently according to their respective majors. Descending the grand marble staircase toward the grounds, Mikhail confirms with her that they were supposed to gather at the training field. Wading into the buzzing crowd of chattering students, the century-old girl scans the sea of unfamiliar faces around her. Glancing about with mild urgency for her assigned team, Lavianje suddenly brightens as she spots a familiar figure and calls out to Lord Loren. Waving energetically from across the field, a bespectacled girl shouts for her to come over here, and Lavianje warmly greets Kartika-chan and says she looks forward to working with her today as well. Introducing her first teammate with genuine fondness, the century-old girl explains that Kartika-chan is the third daughter of a lower noble family working part-time as a seamstress, serving in the magic division as support and healing, an honest and very cute girl. Beaming brightly with a raised finger, a cheerful boy offers a sunny good morning and remarks on the lovely weather, which Lavianje readily agrees is true. Introducing him next, she explains that Lorenkuin is the magic division sub-leader, the eldest son of a merchant family and of commoner status, calm and gentle like a herbivore man, yet fighting on the front lines and gathering materials and meat from magical beasts. Approaching with a blunt nod, a stern-faced young man tells the lady he looks forward to working with her, and she returns the sentiment in kind. Presenting the last of them, the talentless Villainess introduces their team leader Ralph, a lower noble's second son who chose the adventurer's course, stern in face and build, but in truth a kind-hearted lover of flowers. Watching him plant himself at the front line to face a towering mantis beast head-on, she reflects with quiet admiration that this is exactly what a true leader looks like. Raising a gloved finger as ingredients float in her thoughts, the century-old girl explains that her main role is taking charge of all the meals, along with minor rear support and camp preparations. Gathering with her 3 companions in the sunlit grass, she notes they are always a team of 4 who, having gone on subjugation missions many times before, fully understand one another's strengths and weaknesses. Slamming the mood into gear, an instructor throws up a hand and bellows for all leaders to gather because the lots are about to be drawn. The instructor calls number 1 as the pairings begin, and Lorenkuin urges the group forward with a simple "let's go." Explaining the system with numbered cards crossing between rows, the century-old girl notes that this time the subjugation mission is decided entirely by lottery, pairing second-year and fourth-year students who draw matching numbers. Watching the numbers tick past with quiet, half-lidded interest, the reincarnated Villainess wonders what kind of team her own number 9 will end up paired with. Their number is finally called, and the 4 of them turn as looming shadows stretch across the ground toward them. Stepping into view, 4 upperclassmen arrive, 3 unfamiliar figures flanking one smirking, wavy-haired young man at the center. Extending a hand with blunt professionalism, Ralph introduces himself as the team leader and says he looks forward to working with them today. Cutting straight across the greeting, the smirking upperclassman drawls that if it isn't Lady Roble, adding that he knew he recognized her. Recognition clicks coldly into place for the talentless Villainess, one of the second prince's followers. Noting acidly that it's extremely rude to interrupt Ralph's greeting, she wonders privately whether this man sees anyone but himself in his entire field of vision. Closing her eyes with a beatific, razor-sharp smile, the century-old girl greets him with a pleasant good day, Prince Nilti. Stepping forward to salvage the situation, Lorenkuin politely reminds everyone that today is a joint training session involving real danger and offers to introduce their team composition first. Sighing internally behind her serene expression, she admits she'd far rather ignore him, but among everyone present, she alone shares his status, so troublesome or not, she has to entertain him. Smirking with open malice, Prince Nilti sneers that her incompetence remains unchanged and mocks her for failing to even become team leader in Group D, prompting her to mildly ask whether he means to imply Group D is inferior. Folding his arms with a taunting grin, he demands whether she feels no shame as the fiancé of the nation's second prince, and she pleasantly replies that she doesn't feel anything at all. Pressing her hands together with a radiant, utterly unbothered smile, The talentless Villainess declares that if he has no response to this conversation, she'll simply repeat herself as many times as needed. Today is a joint training session that involves danger, so first let their leader give his greetings. Sagging slightly, Lavianje gamely offers once again to introduce their team composition. Bristling with wounded pride, Prince Nilty demands to know how someone like her dares ignore him and prioritize her own assertions, snarling whether she is making a fool of the Nilty family prince. Smiling faintly with her eyes closed, the century-old girl observes that his polite speech vanished remarkably fast and wonders where the talk about the second prince went, then coolly informs him she hasn't the slightest bit of interest in him. Cheerfully steamrolling him for the third time, she repeats that today is a joint training session involving danger, so first let their leader give his greetings and introduce their team composition. Snapping completely, the enraged prince lunges forward screaming that she dares repeat the same thing over and over and demanding just how far she intends to make a fool of him. A sharp, commanding voice cuts clean through the mounting hostility, ordering the furious Enrique to hold himself back immediately. Stepping calmly into the brewing storm, the composed sub-leader coolly reminds everyone that subjugating magical beasts remains genuine combat even during training, firmly declaring the lady is entirely right about their pressing time constraints and requesting they refrain from meaningless conversation for the team's sake. Watching the elegant intervention with sparkling eyes, the reincarnated Villainess gushes internally over the amazing lady's sheer coolness, suddenly wondering if this is the famous Miss Michiara rumored to possess her own devoted fan club. Bowing his stern head, Ralph insists his own second-year team should be the ones apologizing, then politely requests permission to introduce themselves and explain their team's characteristics. Offering a small, effortlessly graceful smile, the sub-leader warmly grants his request without hesitation. Scoffing bitterly from the sidelines, the humiliated Enrique sneers that there is absolutely no point in asking about the characteristics of a class as pathetic as 2D. His face twisting into pure, unfiltered contempt, the arrogant second son coldly declares that nothing changes the simple fact that they are utterly useless. A frozen, suffocating silence crashes over the group as the mortified sub-leader awkwardly calls out Lord Enrique's name. Recovering smoothly, the sub-leader gestures toward the scowling young man and introduces their leader as Lord Enrique Nerdy, second son of one of the 4 great ducal houses and a major in the magician department. Whipping his head around with a venomous glare, the seething noble snaps that the failures from Class D had better never dare call him by name. Pressing a hand to her cheek with a radiant, utterly unbothered smile, the talentless Villainess innocently muses that absolutely no one actually meant to do such a thing. Her eyes gleaming with wicked, grandmotherly amusement, the century-old girl sweetly wonders aloud whether he brought it up because he feels lonely that nobody calls him by name at all. Erupting into a vein-popping rage, the humiliated leader demands to know if Lady Roble has something to say, while the ancient soul simply beams with sparkling delight at how utterly adorable he is. Sweating profusely, the sub-leader timidly asks permission to speak as the furious Enrique roars to know what that infuriating smile means, and the Villainess cheerfully insists he shouldn't mind her at all. Radiating an overwhelming aura of lilies and effortless charm, the sub-leader introduces herself as Minacure Uzaira of a frontier marquis family, warmly inviting the team to simply call her Mina, and the delighted Villainess instantly accepts with a heart-eyed, gleeful yes. Turning to gesture behind her, Mina introduces the remaining pair as Petulim Luchnik, the marquis's son, and Medicana Twyla, the marquis's daughter. Staring flatly ahead with freckled indifference, the young marquis's son permits them to call him Rim strictly for the duration of the joint training, coldly clarifying he will absolutely not allow the familiarity to continue afterward. Shouldering her cloak with a cool, measured glance, the marquis's daughter offers Mighty as her temporary name, pointedly asking whether they will extend her the same courtesy given their differing status and abilities. Ralph answers with a single stern word of understanding as his 4-person team quietly absorbs the frigid, thinly veiled condescension radiating from their 4th-year partners. Turning her attention to the pair of nobles, Mina explains that despite specializing in management and wave magic, the 2 of them will also be handling healing and rear support for this particular mission. Turning toward the assembled second-years, Mina evenly notes that both of her noble teammates possess far greater magical power than they do. Smiling with effortless, flower-framed grace, the sub-leader adds that unlike them the pair holds absolutely no real combat experience beyond the academy walls, expressing her sincere hope that the 2 teams will exert a positive influence on each other. Clasping her hands together with hearts practically bursting from her sparkling eyes, The ancient soul gushes internally over how refreshing the woman is and declares her a truly ideal and wonderful knight. Bellowing across the field with cheerful, booming authority, the instructor announces that once introductions are finished, everyone should grab their luggage and head to the teleportation circle, entering as a group the moment their number is called. Gesturing politely toward the glowing circle, Mina addresses the noble lady and asks whether they shall be on their way. Falling into step beside her, the sub-leader sincerely apologizes for their team leader's abominable behavior, and the talentless Villainess breezily assures her there is absolutely no need for any apology. A faint bead of sweat traces her temple as the composed knight hesitates, softly beginning with a weighty however. Lowering her voice with visible discomfort, Mina admits it is presumptuous of her to say but confesses she would like the lady to hold a bit more awareness of her position as a noble. Smiling knowingly, the century-old girl replies that she fully understands the implication, observing that someone from the frontier-guarding Uzaira Marquis family must certainly harbor thoughts about her behavior. Closing her eyes with serene, 100-year certainty, the reincarnated Villainess calmly declares that being labeled tactless is vastly preferable to putting on airs and endangering the entire group during real combat against magical beasts. Blinking in stunned silence, the sub-leader stares at her with an expression of complete, disarmed astonishment. Recovering her composure, Mina remarks that such a response is remarkably mature, and the ancient soul modestly admits she rather has to admire the sentiment herself. A soft, secretive smile curves across the century-old girl's lips as the two women reach a quiet, unspoken understanding. Boots settle onto the shimmering teleportation array as the combined team gathers, the intricate magic circle flaring brilliantly to life beneath them. Sneering at her through the blinding surge of light, the vindictive Enrique mutters darkly about a mere dropout like her. Turning his head with a slow, venomous smirk, the arrogant ducal heir tells her to at the very least try not to drag the rest of them down. Her eyes glinting with sweet, terrifying menace beneath her flowing hair, the notorious Villainess softly promises that she shall punish him. Her enormous eye widening in delighted recognition, the ancient soul murmurs, "Oh my," immediately noticing the magic circle contains a mechanism designed exclusively for their team. Radiating dazzling, otherworldly beauty as light swirls around her, the century-old girl muses that they shall simply see how this turns out and resolves to thoroughly enjoy today's training as well. A colossal, nightmarish arachnid beast erupts from the trilene with shrieking limbs and gnashing mandibles, and the confrontation with the magic beast explodes into motion. Sweating profusely with his face drained of all color, the arrogant ducal heir emits a pathetic, strangled whimper of pure terror at the towering monster. Collapsing gracelessly onto the dirt with his limbs splayed uselessly, the once haughty leader crumples into a trembling, useless heap. Whipping around with fierce determination, the notorious Villainess shouts to Castjon that they are going to trap the magic beast, and the sacred beast EY confirms. Raising one slender arm with absolute, effortless command, the ancient soul channels her immense hidden power in a single fluid motion. A colossal pit yawns open beneath the writhing centipede as her precisely constructed trap slams into existence, while gleaming weapons flare to life across the battlefield. Charging in without hesitation, Loren roars that he will burn the torso section as searing flame magic detonates against the beast's segmented shell. Fire devours the creature's writhing lower body while the two nobles watch the blaze consume it in stunned silence. Barking crisp battlefield instructions, the fourth year commands that after slicing the torso and severing the head they must kick it to the right, and Ralph confirms without a flicker of hesitation. Blades flashing in perfect synchronization, Mina and Ralph launch themselves at the beast in a devastating coordinated strike. Steel screams through chitin as the two frontliners carve the monster apart midair with brutal, flawless precision. The severed head tumbles through the smoke as a fighter drives forward relentlessly, refusing to let the creature recover for even an instant. Shouting that he is kicking it, Ralph slams his boot into the flying head while his partner roars her confirmation. The mangled head strikes the ground with a wet splat and skitters helplessly across the dirt as an onlooker gapes in disbelief. Assessing the aftermath with sharp efficiency, Mina asks Ralph whether he can use wind magic to sink the massive body into the pit, and the stern-faced leader answers that she should simply leave it to him. Turning her steady gaze toward the towering carcass, the composed sub-leader firmly declares that she will help as well. Wind magic howls across the clearing as the two of them drive the enormous corpse steadily into the gaping hole. Stepping back as the last of the body slides into the darkness, the pair watches the massive remains vanish completely beneath the earth. Standing back to back with weapons drawn, The two leaders share a silent moment of hard-won mutual respect. Raising a gloved finger with a serene, dangerous smile, the century-old girl remarks that they need only add a bit more fuel right about there. A towering inferno erupts from the pit, incinerating the magic beast's remains in a roaring pillar of white-hot flame. Turning cheerfully toward her bespectacled teammate, the talentless Villainess asks Kartika-chan whether she could seal the smoldering hole with magic. Clasping her hands together with sparkling, radiant delight, the honest little healer breathlessly asks if that means a steam roast and eagerly accepts with utter pleasure. Tilting her head thoughtfully, the century-old girl estimates it will take about an hour, noting that simply leaving it be should do the trick perfectly. Bouncing with unrestrained excitement, Kartika and Loren gush that they finally get to taste the lady's cooking, practically vibrating through the agonizing hour-long wait. Pressing a hand to her cheek with a blissful, grandmotherly smile, the ancient soul reveals they were never truly hunting monsters but merely gathering ingredients, warmly declaring their honest eagerness utterly adorable since one simply cannot fight on an empty stomach. Approaching with businesslike composure, Loren informs the lady that the monster wards surrounding the centipede should be collected and maintained immediately. Reaching into her bag with a serene smile, the reincarnated Villainess thanks him for the enormous help and offers him something in exchange, explaining it is a standard monster ward carrying a slight boost. Stepping forward without hesitation, another teammate offers to lend a hand as well, receiving quiet gratitude in return. Handing over the compact magical device, the century-old girl explains that centipedes frequently appear in pairs and asks whether they might set this up well ahead of time. Passing the ward into waiting hands, she politely requests the same area as usual with practiced, easy familiarity. Accepting the small devices with a chorus of agreement, the assembled team members confirm their assignments while the fourth-year nobles watch with dawning, uneasy respect. Steam curls lazily from the sealed earth as Loren and the others disperse across the clearing to set the traps in place. Crossing his arms with an insufferable smirk, the arrogant ducal heir grudgingly admits she is somewhat useful after all. Kneeling calmly over her spread magical tools, the notorious Villainess innocently asks whether he is offering to help with the maintenance, and Enrique instantly recoils, insisting that even with cleaning magic he would rather not dirty his shoes. His face contorting with pure aristocratic disdain, the second son demands to know who she thinks she is, sneering that such menial work suits a noble lady with magic power too pathetic to even cast spells properly. Glaring down at the scuffed leather, the petty magician complains that his shoes have gotten dirty and pointedly wonders aloud whether he deserves at least an apology. Resting her cheek against her hand with sweet, ancient amusement, the century-old girl silently muses whether this is what the youth these days call picking a fight, deciding there is no need to respond at all. Cutting in with flat, freckled bluntness, Rim informs Enrique that he should apologize before touching such a magical tool, adding that there is one more matter regarding apologies entirely. Turning his sharp gaze on the kneeling Villainess, the Marquis's son demands to know what that earlier subjugation was about, pointedly asking why someone who isn't the leader was issuing orders to such an experienced team. Fixing her with a stern, uncompromising stare, Rim declares that even a noble lady must follow instructions from senior students and leaders during joint training, requesting she refrain from acting entirely on her own, and the ancient soul blinks with wide, dangerous innocence. Gesturing flatly toward the smoldering battlefield, Rim insists he merely followed their leader's orders and gave instructions, prompting the century-old girl to sweetly ask whether he was somehow unable to grasp the actual situation. Recalling the humiliating scene with merciless clarity, the ancient soul notes that one of them remained sitting after falling flat on his backside while the other two did absolutely nothing beyond casting defensive magic around themselves. Her hand hovering delicately over her scattered tools, the century-old girl innocently muses that she assumed they were focused on assessing the situation, wondering aloud whether she was somehow mistaken. Gazing down at her precisely arranged magical implements, the reincarnated Villainess silently marvels that calling them just things during a crisis demanding immediate action reveals a truly appalling lack of danger awareness. Leaves drift lazily through the towering canopy as an ominous, unspoken truth about this particular forest hangs heavily in the air. Closing her eyes with a small, weary sigh, the ancient soul quietly decides to simply leave the entire matter be. Studying the charred remains of the beast, she reminds herself that today is merely training and that unexpected complications are entirely normal. A tiny seedling sprouts in her imagination as the century-old girl concludes there is a mountain of things she wants to say but resolves to stay silent, unwilling to crush the budding growth of the young. Her eyes igniting with sparkling 100-year-old excitement, the reincarnated Villainess gushes internally that she wants to experience student life again for the first time in a century and cannot wait for tonight's youthful overnight camping trip. A voice cuts sharply through her giddy fantasy, addressing Lavianje by name and warning the Duchess not to get too carried away. Planting a hand on her hip with a smug, cutting grin, Mighty dismisses Group D as bottom-rung nobodies good only for monster hunting and food gathering, insisting they merely succeeded because they happen to be used to it. Leaning in with a saccharine, venomous smile, the Marquis's daughter declares she is certain the lady understands they are in no way inferior to her. Waving her hands with a cheerfully oblivious grin, the talentless Villainess agrees she doesn't think them inferior at all, merely lacking in ability. Standing over her in a semicircle, the fourth years press their case, pointing out that she can only use basic lifestyle magic and relies entirely on magical tools, insisting there is no possible way she survives this safely without their upperclassmen assistance. Her smile widening with poisonous sweetness, Mighty adds that the same naturally applies to all the other second years as well. Magic circles flare brilliantly to life around her as the Marquis's daughter declares that no matter how large a role the lady believes she played, every scrap of the credit will be going to them. Her eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light, Mighty purrs that even the beast from earlier was ultimately finished off by Lady Mina, pressing a finger to her lips and asking whether that isn't right. A single ancient eye narrows behind curtains of pale hair as the century-old girl calmly observes that the girl is deploying a dark element spell specialized in mental manipulation. Recognizing the technique instantly, the reincarnated Villainess identifies it as mental resonance magic designed to synchronize the caster's mind with the targets and gradually assault their spirit. Dropping her gaze with quiet, devastating contempt, the ancient soul notes that a caster with great magical power would normally hold the advantage, yet this girl's magic is so utterly sloppy it doesn't affect her in the slightest. Pressing her fingers to her temples with a bewildered, utterly unbothered smile, the century-old girl silently despairs that she cannot comprehend a single word this younger person is saying, wondering if this is the infamous generation gap. Gazing wearily up at the dense forest canopy, the ancient soul suggests they all set aside their swollen egos and focus on the far more pressing task of escaping this endless wilderness. Waving off her sensible plea with a dismissive humph, Rim flatly agrees with Enrique that they are merely accompanying underclassmen on a training exercise beneath their notice. Sneering down at the neatly arranged magical tools scattered across the cloth, the Marquis's son declares that pointless pride and vanity are an absolute nuisance, and that it would be deeply annoying if the underclassmen mistook fourth-year support for their own success. Turning his face into the shadows with a slow, venomous smile, Enrique asks whether the malicious noble lady who delights in tormenting her own little sister finally understands her true place. Covering her cheek with a serene, entirely amused giggle, the notorious Villainess dismisses the accusation outright, cheerfully declaring she has absolutely no time for such petty little hobbies. Reaching calmly for a magical tool with a steady gloved hand, the talentless Villainess announces that since the joke has clearly landed, everyone should now start focusing properly on the actual work. Folding his arms with a smug, self-satisfied smirk, Enrique privately notes that the wicked woman is still trying to talk, and coolly resolves to simply ignore her entirely. Insisting with a sweetly poisonous lilt that she is still a noble lady in name at least, the reincarnated Villainess innocently wonders aloud whether Rim's mana is so pitifully low that Mighty's magic worked far too well on him, while she herself silently notes she had decided to keep quiet. Throwing his head back in a burst of cruel, shrieking laughter, Enrique jabs a mocking hand toward her and spits out a single scornful word about how utterly pathetic she is. Lowering her eyes to the tool in her hands with a small, unbothered smile, the talentless Villainess pleasantly remarks that they all seem to be having fun while she quietly focuses on the maintenance. Turning his head sharply with a cold, impatient glare, Enrique demands to know whether the noblewoman is even listening to a word he says. Lifting her gaze with a slow, devastating smile, the century-old girl cheerfully admits she wasn't listening at all, then apologizes with exquisite politeness that her task prevents her from entertaining him further. Recoiling in furious disbelief as she calmly tells them all to go on enjoying themselves, Enrique explodes, screaming at the wicked woman to repeat exactly what she just said. A sudden, thunderous voice slams through the clearing, commanding everyone to stop this idiocy immediately. Whirling around in stunned confusion as Mina stands rigid and grim-faced, the fourth years stammer in shock while Enrique demands to know what Mighty thinks she is doing to the princess. Sweat beading down her pale temple, Mina's strained voice cuts through the chaos, demanding to know how not one of them has noticed it yet. Staring up at the eerily still forest canopy, the frontier marquis's daughter grimly declares that the presence saturating these woods is absolutely not normal. Scoffing openly among upperclassmen who fail to grasp the gravity of the situation, Enrique sneers at Mina and demands to know what nonsense she is spouting about this being anything more than a simple matter. Clutching her hands anxiously beneath the shadowed leaves, Kartika hesitantly adds that Nerdy had only been following the orders of the leader, a noble, leaving the tension coiled and waiting to snap. Clapping a hand lightly to her shoulder with a bright, entirely untroubled smile, the reincarnated Villainess breezily announces that she is perfectly fine. Rising smoothly to her feet with her cloak settling around her, the talentless Villainess draws every startled gaze in the clearing as she steps forward with quiet purpose. Turning toward her with a slow, needling smirk, Enrique sneers and asks what it is now, and whether she has come all this way merely to complain. Whirling defensively with a magic tool clutched tight in his hands, the second son of a great ducal house mockingly asks if she intends to attack him with the contents of her bag, jeering that with the princess's pathetic magic power she could never win a magical contest anyway. Snapping her head around with a sharp, alarmed shout, Mina cries out for her lord as steel rasps against its sheath. Lowering her lashes with a serene, faintly exasperated smile, the century-old girl privately marvels at how aggressive everyone has become, calmly noting this must be what people call a touch-and-go situation. Pausing mid-thought with a puzzled little hum, the ancient soul suddenly recalls that this lord and the young lady are in fact exactly the same age, which means, yes, the answer is obvious. Bristling with a red-faced snarl as her gaze settles knowingly upon them, Enrique remains oblivious to her dawning conclusion that these two are simply going through rebellious phases as well. Clapping her gloved hands together with a radiant, blindingly delighted beam, the reincarnated Villainess exclaims that the two of them are exactly the same, aren't they? Raising a single instructive finger toward the utterly bewildered pair, the century-old girl cheerfully insists there is no need to worry at all, since it isn't their fault and only hormones are at work. Cupping her flushed cheeks with a giggling, insufferably tender smile, the ancient soul basks in their horror as Enrique stammers out a strangled pea-princess, and demands to know why she is looking at him with such an unbearably warm gaze. Standing side by side in blank, hollow-eyed shock, the two fourth years numbly admit they are glad she explained it, agreeing that these sorts of things really never get through unless someone says them out loud. Whirling around with a fierce, blazing grin and utterly unshakable conviction, the notorious Villainess declares that above all else, the true greatest enemy here is hunger. Marching briskly past the stunned onlookers with her cloak snapping behind her, the talentless Villainess proclaims a full stomach an absolute must-have item for soothing rebellious irritability. Planting her boot down hard as equipment crashes into place, the century-old girl announces with unstoppable momentum that it is time to start cooking. Pointing with brilliant, sparkling eyes as Kartika enthusiastically throws up a hand, the reincarnated Villainess sweetly asks the honest little healer to punch a hole through the center of the lid, and Kartika instantly grasps that it's meant to save time. Spinning toward the front line with commanding delight, the talentless Villainess calls out to Loren and Ralph for the finishing roast, explaining they'll add a gorgeous roasted aroma to the dish while Loren eagerly promises to leave it to him. Summoning a swirling disk of wind above his open palm, the calm frontline fighter announces he will adjust the flames with precise wind magic. Barking crisp, rapid-fire orders to send Loren in with high heat and Ralph spreading the fire evenly with wind, the century-old girl orchestrates the entire operation while the fourth years watch in slack-jawed silence. Standing frozen and utterly forgotten as the well-oiled machine roars into motion around him, a panicking Enrique can only sputter out a desperate cry for everyone to wait. Turning his head with a flat, deeply unimpressed stare, Ralph coolly informs the sputtering fourth years that there is no problem whatsoever, while Enrique shrieks in outrage demanding to know why lower-classmen, Class D of all people, are acting on their own initiative. Storming forward with his face twisting in fury, the second son of a great ducal house insists it absolutely is a problem, declaring that the upperclassmen and high-ranking nobles are the ones looking after them, and that reckless actions endangering the group would leave the fourth years in trouble. Closing his eyes with a slow, weary breath, the stern-faced leader quietly murmurs that he sees exactly how things stand. Opening his eyes with cold finality as the entire group turns to stare, Ralph flatly invites the fourth years to leave the beast barrier entirely and take themselves somewhere else. Rearing back with his face contorting in scarlet, spitting rage, Enrique screams at the commoner to watch his filthy mouth. Narrowing his gaze into a hard, unflinching glare, the stern-faced leader fixes the shrieking noble with a look of pure, quiet contempt. Squaring his shoulders as the fourth years visibly flinch back, Ralph coldly states that it infuriates him simply to watch his comrades be made fools of. Standing firm against their stunned silence, the lower noble's second son adds that he has heard plenty about them from the graduates as well. Pressing a finger to her lips with eyes shining like tiny stars, the reincarnated Villainess listens in delight as Ralph accuses Mighty of dulling his comrade's capacity for individual judgment in a place this dangerous. Sweeping his glare across the entire fourth-year team, the stern-faced leader condemns a leader who orders magic that could bring death to the whole team, and foolish teammates who never once questioned it or even tried to stop it. Locking eyes with Enrique with absolute, unwavering finality, Ralph declares that as the leader of Class D himself, he has decided the fourth years are entirely unnecessary. Standing rigid in shocked silence as Kartika clutches her hands to her chest, Mina and the others absorb the devastating verdict without a single word of protest. Staring down at the churned earth between them, the stern-faced leader coldly asks whether they truly believed the underclassmen wouldn't understand, them who haven't even seen it. Turning away with a scoffing, dismissive sneer, Enrique brushes the entire condemnation aside as the ranting of an utter fool. Jabbing a triumphant finger skyward with a mocking grin, the second son of a great ducal house sneers that Class D shouldn't get cocky when they lack both experience and brains, insisting a student training ground shouldn't contain life-threatening dangers to begin with. Lifting his eyes in cold, absolute certainty, Ralph fixes them with a look that stops every jeer dead in the air. A creeping, ink-black dread spreads across the forest as a single ominous name surfaces from the darkness: the box garden of venomous insects. Falling into stunned, sweating silence as the name lands, the entire assembled group stares at the stern-faced leader while Mina's composure visibly cracks. Gazing grimly through the tangled brush, the lower noble's second son declares that although it is his first time setting foot here, he is absolutely certain this place is the box garden of venomous insects. Raising a trembling hand with a sickly, sweat-slicked smile, Enrique desperately protests that this is a joint training session organized by the academy itself, and that they would never, ever be led into a place like that. Gazing coolly ahead with quiet, unshakable certainty, the reincarnated Villainess reveals she had already recognized the possibility they might end up inside this forest, since she aims to become a mage in the future, a confession that jolts Loren into stunned silence. Sweeping a hand toward the surrounding trees as the fourth years stand frozen, Ralph explains that scanning even the immediate vicinity would turn up several centipede-class insect-type magical beasts. Looming in the shadowed underbrush, a massive armored insect utters his grim declaration that the only place in this entire country where such creatures crawl about in abundance is the danger level A box garden of venomous insects. Staring up at the impossibly dense canopy, the stern-faced leader grimly notes that insects swarm here as everyone knows, that this area harbors mostly enormous magical beasts, and that most of them are venomous and rated at least danger level B. Turning his blazing eyes onto the sputtering nobles with absolute conviction, Ralph declares that anyone in this forest clinging to petty claims of lineage or seniority while endangering their lives is unnecessary, and demands to know what is wrong with that judgment. Clutching her hands to her mouth in mounting horror as Loren pales beside her, Kartika desperately begs someone to confirm there is no possible way this is truly the box garden of venomous insects. Sweat beading down her rigid profile as she turns her face away, Mina quietly confirms the devastating truth: it is no lie at all. Reeling backward with the color draining from his face as Kartika collapses to her knees in the dirt, the entire team absorbs the crushing weight of their situation. Clicking his tongue with sweat sliding down his temple and his bravado finally cracking, Enrique can no longer summon a single word of protest. Lowering her eyes with the name echoing coldly through her mind, the ancient soul turns the phrase over with quiet, century-old recognition: the box garden of venomous insects. Recalling knowledge from a world that does not exist here, the century-old girl remembers that Kotaku once referred to a cursed object made by sealing insects and amphibians inside a jar, forcing them to slaughter one another until the sole survivor could be used for a curse. Observing the enormous striped larvae crawling freely along the trunks, the ancient soul notes that this place is essentially their garden, a relatively small forest sealed off entirely by barriers and magic. Surveying the sealed, humming canopy stretching endlessly overhead, the reincarnated Villainess reflects that this is, in short, a forest inhabited by nothing but powerful magical beasts. Silhouetted against the pale sky, A colossal armored horror looms as she recalls precisely why this place carries certification as Danger Level A, the very highest classification of threat. Mentally reviewing the adventurer and monster threat rankings that run from A down to F, the century-old girl calmly notes that the centipede they slaughtered earlier would be classified merely as AB. Watching the segmented bodies coil through the trees, the ancient soul coldly amends that the B rating applies only to a single specimen, because once they swarm, they are reclassified as A. Cataloging the carnivorous spiders and ants that infest this place, the reincarnated Villainess grimly notes that the ants in particular are dangerous enough to earn an A rating entirely on their own. Silhouetted against a stark white void, the towering forms of legend loom as she recalls that beyond the F2A beasts exist rare disaster-class threats ranked S, and that adventurers, likewise, can reach that same terrifying rank. Contemplating a chest bound tight in heavy chains, the ancient soul notes that such existences are so exceptionally powerful that their very traits are classified, sealed away to prevent any nation's military from ever wielding them. Gazing out over the vast, silent mountain valley, the century-old girl recalls the whispered stories that even this forest of venomous spirits once harbored an S-class beast, leaving the deadly truth of their situation coiled and waiting. Standing together in the shadowed clearing, the assembled students absorb the brutal truth that only seasoned A-rank adventurers or full A-rank parties are ever permitted to set foot in this lethal place. The barrier sealing the forest is monstrously solid, designed to trap the most dangerous magical beasts inside, easy to enter from the outside, yet very nearly impossible to escape. The chilling explanation lands with crushing weight. The transfer magic circle meant for the ordinary training grounds had been deliberately tampered with to hurl them into this venomous forest instead. Apart from the sharp-eyed Lady Mina, the entire upperclassmen team had smugly assumed this would be nothing more than routine training, with Enrique sniffing that the whole affair had proven somewhat useful. The dawning horror finally strips the arrogance from their faces as the second son of a great ducal house scowls, a freckled teammate breaks into stifled tears, and the elegant subleader stares ahead in cold, sweating silence. Pressing a gloved hand to her cheek with a serene, utterly unbothered smile, the century-old girl cheerfully remarks that the mood has turned positively funereal now that everyone has finally grasped the situation. Cutting cleanly through the suffocating despair, the stern-faced leader narrows his eyes and begins to speak with grim, unwavering purpose. Standing at the center of both teams beneath the towering trees, Ralph levels his gaze at the fourth years and bluntly demands to know what they intend to do. His question sharpens into something merciless as he asks the trembling upperclassmen exactly how they plan to survive. Enrique's sneering composure crumbles entirely as the freckled rim clutches his face in terror and Mina and Mighty stare back in sweating, wordless dread. Wasting absolutely no time on their despair, the talentless Villainess brightly instructs the group on handling a defeated magical beast, ordering them to reinforce their bodies with magic and haul the severed centipede. Beaming with irrepressible energy, the honest little healer enthusiastically confirms the command while Loren turns away with a long-suffering exhale. The colossal severed segment crashes down onto the forest floor with a ground-shaking thud, kicking up a violent spray of leaves. Grimacing in absolute revulsion as he drags the massive carcass, Enrique bitterly demands to know why a noble son like himself is being forced to perform such degrading manual labor. Trembling violently with disgust, the arrogant magician recoils as the slick shell slides beneath his gloves, letting out a strangled, horrified groan. Kneeling side by side in the undergrowth, the reincarnated Villainess and Loren calmly gather armfuls of fresh herbs from the forest floor. Glancing over her shoulder with a placid, satisfied smile, the notorious Villainess remarks that everything appears to be proceeding perfectly smoothly, in case anyone was wondering what exactly they were all doing. The answer is delivered without a flicker of shame. They are dismantling the centipede and prepping the enormous creature for cooking. In response to Ralph's blunt question about survival, even the proud upperclassmen ultimately swallowed their pride and chose mutual cooperation. Cooperation proves a wise decision indeed, since in their current situation the desperate problem of food naturally comes screaming to the very top of the list. Beaming with utter delight, the honest little healer eagerly agrees as the notorious Villainess briskly announces they will begin separating the poison, the organs, and the flesh. Gloved hands work with practiced precision, peeling the massive shell open with a wet, scraping rasp against the leaf-strewn ground. Kneeling beside the enormous segmented carcass, the reincarnated Villainess warmly praises Kartika for having grown remarkably skilled at butchering. Flushing bright red with a radiant, bespectacled smile, The honest little healer stammers out her thanks while the century-old girl inwardly swoons over how adorably sincere the girl is. Together they brace their hands against the pale, cleaned shell, positioning themselves for the final heave. The heavy carapace groans and splits with a low, grinding crack as the ancient soul counts them down and gives the signal. Steam erupts in a fragrant white burst as the shell parts, leaving Kartika's eyes exploding into sparkling stars and the talentless Villainess blushing with quiet triumph. Inhaling the rich aroma of shellfish and sea drifting off the centipede, the ancient soul chuckles knowingly, privately noting that back in her previous world this would have been a famously expensive luxury ingredient. The revelation lands like a dazzling gourmet epiphany. Beneath that horrifying armored exterior, the monstrous flesh is unmistakably, gloriously crab. Tapping her heel with brisk, cheerful authority, the notorious Villainess urges Kartika onward to give it everything she has. Dropping into a low stance with blazing enthusiasm, the honest little healer answers with a delighted yes and hauls the massive shell across the dirt. Bracing together with a hearty shout, the two girls drag the enormous carapace forward in a screeching, dust-throwing heave. Winking with an utterly satisfied grin, the talentless Villainess praises their work and briskly divides the labor, ordering herbs spread across the shelf with the butchered meat layered on top. Working with newfound efficiency, the assembled students slice, arrange, and load the seasoned meat onto the tiered racks under Mina's watchful eye. Pressing a hand to her cheek with a beaming, triumphant smile before the fully loaded smoker, the reincarnated Villainess declares the preparation complete and announces that now they simply wait. Tugging lightly for her attention, the elegant subleader quietly addresses the notorious Villainess as Milady. Frowning in genuine curiosity, Mina asks why some of the meat on the racks has been buried in herbs while the rest has been left entirely bare. A slow, delighted smile curves across the century-old girl's face at the sharpness of the question. Praising the question warmly, she explains that the herbs possess antibacterial properties, so they were laid beneath everything and piled again atop whichever cuts they want infused with aroma. The uncovered portions, she continues, will have their moisture drawn out and be smoked instead, since the smoky fragrance stirs the appetite and anything left uneaten today will be dried overnight into preserved rations. Continuing her serene lecture, the reincarnated Villainess explains that scoring between shell and flesh at the four corners lets moisture escape, shrinking the meat so it holds together and lifts out cleanly. Absorbing the explanation with visible amazement, the elegant subleader murmurs her understanding before bluntly asking why a noble lady would possibly know so much. Mina presses further, admitting she has never once heard of eating a centipede, yet this girl knows precisely how to butcher it and exactly what the herbs accomplish, knowledge no noble lady should ever possess. Sweating faintly with genuine discomfort, the frontier marquis's daughter apologizes for any offense while noting that rumor paints Lavianje as so bound by pride she fled even bridal education and the proper accomplishments of a lady. Behind her placid, hand-to-cheek smile, the century-old girl calmly registers that despite the extremely polite tone, this is still an unconscious probe. Her gaze sharpens beneath the curtain of pale hair as she acknowledges the girl means no harm, yet they are hardly on terms where personal circumstances can be revealed. Beaming with radiant, utterly unbothered cheer, the talentless Villainess deploys her trusty stock phrase, declaring bridal education and noble accomplishments are no fun at all while Class D is enormously fun, and any knowledge that helps her enjoy herself is always welcome. Privately, the ancient soul chuckles that she already mastered every one of those lessons and skills long ago, so there is absolutely no need to study them a second time. Stiffening in visible dismay, Mina stammers out an apology as she realizes her question landed far more sharply than intended. Cutting in with cold, unwavering authority, the stern-faced leader states that when working together he would like her to stop hurling strange accusations or forcing her own values onto others. Wide-eyed and flustered, the elegant subleader protests that she never meant it as an accusation at all. Lowering her head with sweating, genuine remorse, Mina apologizes anyway, admitting that regardless of intent she was completely out of line. Turning to face her squarely, the notorious Villainess calmly concedes that she has indeed abandoned her duties and acted entirely as she pleased, and that anyone is free to look only at those parts and judge her however they wish. A weighted pause hangs between their boots on the dirt as she adds that there is, however, one thing she would like to say. Leaning in dangerously close with a knowing smile, she reveals that her knowledge was taught to her by someone among the royal family's shadows, then coolly asks Mina to refrain from unnecessary prying. The elegant subleader freezes, a bead of sweat sliding down her stunned, wide-eyed face. Inwardly, the century-old girl concedes that phrased that way, it is entirely understandable someone might mistake it for something unusual. Silhouetted against the light, she privately notes she has told no lie whatsoever. She truly did hear how delicious centipede is from Mr. Garvey of the Royal Shadows, though that hardly means all her knowledge came from him. Cradling her chin with a wistful, gloved hand, the ancient soul admits she doesn't want dear Lady Mina, who feels like a precious grandchild, to hate her, but she wants unnecessary digging into her memories from beyond this life even less. A princess in one life and an 86-year-old woman in the next naturally knows a trick or two. Sweating and subdued beneath the towering trees, the elegant sub-leader falls silent, thoroughly rattled by the deflection she cannot begin to see through. Fixing her with an unimpressed stare, the stern-faced leader flatly informs the lady that she is making an awfully wicked face, prompting a small, caught-out admission that she must have slipped a little. Pressing a gloved hand to her lips with a delighted, muffled chuckle, the century-old girl privately marvels at how wonderfully sharp Ralph's intuition truly is. Announcing they will be camping here tonight since both Loren and Kartika are apparently starving, Ralph draws a cheerful reply that they had better hurry, then. Explaining that Loren has already begun preparing the fire, the leader asks her to handle the cooking, drawing an amused inquiry about whether her role remains exactly the same as always. Beaming with a radiant, closed-eye smile, the talentless Villainess accepts the assignment without a moment's hesitation. Walking briskly beside him, she instructs the group to also collect soil from around the centipede, since it can be used to ward off or attract magical beasts of equal or lower rank. Ralph reports that the noble sons have requested the magic stones and materials harvested from the centipede, wanting to save face by claiming the credit, and she calmly tells him to hand it all over if it avoids trouble. Apologizing for seeming to rush her, the stern-faced leader explains that given their location they cannot expect immediate rescue, so he intends to take action, though the talk about their future can wait until after they eat. Cradling her chin thoughtfully, she lays out the worst case, relocating closer to the barrier on the Roble side, with the next possible re-establishment 6 months away, and asks whether the fourth years could ever endure half a year here. Gazing at the laden smoking racks, she reflects that as long as they have good food 6 months is hardly long for her own team, but she cannot possibly say the same for the upperclassmen. Walking beside her without softening a single word, Ralph states that if they cannot endure they will simply die for one reason or another, drawing her murmured observation that this is quite a grim outcome. Turning with cold, unwavering conviction, the stern-faced leader declares that a venomous garden is precisely that kind of place, and that the ones he protects are not the sort who would ever lay hands on their own comrades. Pressing a gloved hand to her cheek, the notorious Villainess remarks that Ralph has clearly thought this through a great deal, though it rather feels like he is trying just a little too hard. Pressing on grimly, he admits they still do not even know why they were transferred here, and that too many uncertainties exist to protect everyone and lead them all to escape. Glancing aside with a faint, knowing smile, the ancient soul concedes there are things that bother her as well, but since blaming someone would only breed suspicion and paranoia, she intends to deliberately ignore it for now. Closing her eyes serenely, she concludes that dwelling on it will yield no answer, so they should simply deal with whatever they can. Walking together through the venomous forest, Ralph declares that whatever the reason, he has already decided he is getting out of here alive, with all 4 team members, every single one of them. In the stern-faced leader's mind, that cooperative girl from the 4th years simply is not part of his team, and he judged the situation strictly. Anyone he cannot reliably coordinate with would only become a burden. Smiling with quiet, gracious understanding, the reincarnated Villainess acknowledges that this was his decision as leader and that she comprehends it completely. Ralph concedes that while Mina is genuinely cooperative, that does not mean they need to act together, and that the elegant sub-leader herself fully understands she belongs to a different team. Ralph grimly insists this is a place where lives are at stake, and that anyone acting without deciding by their own will, whether from coercion or a request, will eventually falter and bring death upon themselves or their comrades. Turning to face him with quiet warmth beneath the drifting leaves, the century-old girl gently counters that just because he is the leader does not mean he must shoulder the entire burden alone. Her voice softens into something disarmingly maternal as she reminds him that he is still, after everything, only a 16-year-old boy, leaving the stern-faced leader wide-eyed and utterly frozen. Suddenly thrown into a forest crawling with venomous insects and told to lead, the pressure crushing down on him is heavier than anything he has ever carried, dragging at him like iron shackles. Smiling with serene, closed-eye ease, the reincarnated Villainess observes that once things reach this point everything becomes his own responsibility, so wouldn't it simply be fine if everyone shared that weight instead? Fixing him with a slow, knowing smile amid drifting spider lilies, she asks whether he has forgotten that she is Lavianje Roble, one of the noble daughters of the 4 great ducal houses. She admits without shame that she may run from responsibility whenever the mood takes her, but she has never once run from all of it. The descendants of the royal line and the 4 great ducal houses must take full responsibility in times of crisis. That is precisely why they have commanded respect since ancient times and are permitted to wield such immense power. Reaching out to pat his arm with easy familiarity, the notorious Villainess tells him not to overthink it and to focus for now on filling their stomachs. Beaming up at him with a radiant, closed-eye smile, she promises that once he is full he will feel considerably more at ease. The stern-faced leader stares down at her, eyes wide with something between disbelief and dawning relief. Walking on together beneath a softened sky, Ralph finally exhales a quiet agreement, conceding that she is right. Watching her from a shadowed distance, Loren observes the exchange in silence with an unreadable, faintly narrowed gaze. Recovering his composure, the stern-faced leader announces he will leave the cooking to the lady and pitch the tent after issuing orders to the other 2, drawing a pleasant assent. The chapter turns, carrying the reincarnated Villainess and her team deeper into the venomous garden. Barking crisp instructions across the clearing, Ralph orders Loren to assist the lady with cooking and directs Kartika to gather the soil around the centipede's head for monster repellent. Watching the 3 fall into effortless coordination, the century-old girl warmly remarks that they have all grown into a truly fine team. A shadow of memory crosses her fond smile as she notes that they work together so smoothly now, yet a single year ago they could hardly have been called a team at all. The recollection surfaces sharply, their very first joint subjugation battle, fought alongside the senior class 3A team. Back then Ralph trusted absolutely no one, hurling himself at the monsters entirely alone whenever the impulse struck, and the senior leader, naturally, blew his top. Panicking in the chaos of the disastrous debut battle, Loren nearly struck the senior subleader outright, and got decked with a punch for the sheer trouble. Kartika was so utterly terrified she collapsed where she stood, bawling her eyes out while the senior rearguard beside her merely grimaced in cold contempt. Recalling the senior healer stationed right beside her, Lavianje remembers how they simply turned away, coldly telling the panicking first years to deal with it themselves. In the brutal end, their 2 frontliners were shamelessly used as living monster shields, all of them passing out early from crushing injuries and shock. Abandoning the wounded first years in the very heart of the monster horde, the seniors vanished without ever firing the mandatory emergency flare, leaving the team teetering on the absolute brink of death. Pressing a gloved hand to her lips in quiet deliberation, the century-old girl notes she wanted to keep her true magic secret, but with everyone unconscious and the seniors long gone, there was no risk whatsoever of being seen. A slow, wicked smile blooms across her face as the notorious Villainess decides that if the seniors insist on teaching a lesson, she will join in like a proper student, with spirit and fun. Radiating cheerful malice, the ancient soul cast her magic and sent the entire monster horde stampeding straight toward the senior team as her generous little gift. Casting a suggestion so the beasts wouldn't actually kill the seniors, she titles her masterpiece Hypnosis for the beasts and warmly invites them to play together to their heart's content. Clasping her hands together with a blissful, utterly unbothered smile, the century-old girl muses that sharing experiences together is exactly what youth is all about. After that, she healed every one of their wounded with recovery magic, and the whole battered team rested together until the teachers finally arrived. Those, she sighs fondly, were the days. Having survived that chaotic debut battle, the 4 of them tackled the recovery of salt damage zones together as a genuine team. Guided patiently by graduates of the academy, the young team grew stronger and stronger with every grueling season. Cupping her cheek with a deeply moved sigh, the reincarnated Villainess reflects that their growth in coordination and communication is truly touching, until a voice cuts in, calling for the lady. Turning from the campfire, Ralph asks the talentless Villainess how much herb salt she wants added this time. Snapping out of her nostalgic haze with a bright smile, Lavianje scolds herself to stop wool-gathering and focus entirely on the cooking. Sprinkling the seasoning with practiced, delicate precision, she reflects that cooking is fundamentally about pouring your heart into it and wishing sincerely for it to taste good. Softening as she works, the ancient soul fondly confides that in her past life, making homemade meals like this for her grandkids and great-grandkids had been her purest joy. Falling into an abrupt, heavy silence, Kartika, Loren, and Ralph all stare at her with wide, deeply unsettled eyes. Tilting her head with serene, utterly unbothered composure, the century-old girl innocently asks whatever could be the matter, staring at her like that. A bright little light bulb flashes above her head as the century-old girl innocently concludes that her poor teammates must simply be starving and utterly unable to wait for their meal. Clapping her gloved hands together with brisk cheer, she declares that before the cooking is even finished, they must all work together immediately to prepare for surviving the coming night. Turning a sweetly pointed smile toward the lounging noble, the notorious Villainess wonders aloud why someone so very capable is just standing around doing absolutely nothing, prompting Enrique to explode in outraged disbelief. Lowering her lashes with a chilling, utterly composed calm, she reminds the sputtering noble that if the fire goes out it becomes genuinely dangerous, and surely he already knows that. Gesturing toward the crackling flames, she explains that the repellent alone is nowhere near enough, so they will light a fire, roast the centipede meat, and use the smell to thoroughly intimidate the beasts. Rounding on her with bulging, furious eyes, Enrique demands how she of all people dares to boss him around, while she serenely asks whether he shouldn't finish setting up the tents before darkness falls. Ticking off her points with delicate fingers, the ancient soul patiently clarifies that the repellent merely drives monsters away, and that if he simply leaves it at that, the dangerous ones with genuine fighting intent. Pressing a hand to her cheek with a radiant, terrifyingly sunny smile, she cheerfully finishes that such monsters will eventually break straight through their fragile defenses. Sheer, undiluted horror floods the faces of Kartika, Ralph, and Loren as the crushing reality of her casual warning lands on all three at once. Sweating profusely and flushing scarlet with wounded pride, Enrique shrilly insists that he absolutely knew all of that without her needing to tell him. Whirling on his own bewildered teammates with frantic energy, the arrogant noble barks at them to hurry up and pitch the tents immediately. Jabbing an accusing finger at Loren, Enrique loudly commands the calm frontline fighter to help too, insisting they need every single pair of hands available. Nodding once with a small, deeply satisfied smile, the reincarnated Villainess sends a bewildered Loren scurrying off as the noble screams at him to hurry. Under the sudden, chaotic burst of leadership, both teams finally move as one, hauling canvas and fastening poles while Mina, Rim, and Mighty fall into brisk cooperation. Tending the roaring campfire with quiet satisfaction, Lavianje declares that should just about do it, just as Kartika comes dashing breathlessly toward her. Sniffing eagerly at the drifting aroma, the honest little healer gasps that the smell means the roasting has already started, while Lavianje warmly asks if she has finished with the tent. Pointing back over her shoulder with an awkward, sweating smile, Kartika admits that they are mostly done, but, erupting in another shrill tantrum behind them, Enrique furiously accuses the others of ignoring everything he says and demands they tear it down and do it all over again. Watching the spectacle sideways with heavy-lidded, utterly unbothered eyes, the century-old girl simply murmurs a placid now. Beaming brightly, Kartika explains that the leader asked her to help with the cooking instead, cheerfully volunteering for the grilling as Lavianje thanks her with genuine warmth. Turning eagerly to the sizzling skewers, the honest little healer volunteers to cast a warming spell over everything already grilled. Skewer after glistening skewer piles up in a towering, gloriously charred mountain of seasoned centipede meat wrapped in fragrant herb leaves. Eyes shimmering with pure, unfiltered wonder behind her glasses, Kartika presses both hands to her cheeks and gasps that it looks unbelievably, impossibly good. Glancing toward the distant sound of Enrique still shrieking at his exhausted teammates, the little healer sparkles and suggests they call everyone over now. A beat of awkward silence passes before Lavianje calmly smiles and suggests they simply eat first instead. Winking with delicious mischief, the ancient soul reminds the scandalized girl that the rule is whoever's free eats as soon as it's ready, and besides, more people trying to stop that man will only make him heat up further. Snatching up a skewer with a triumphant war cry, Kartika declares she's absolutely right and dives in, while Lavianje teases that she simply couldn't wait another second. Melting into a blissful, heart-surrounded haze, the honest little healer moans that it is unbelievably, ridiculously good. Offering a steaming bowl with a warm, indulgent smile, the century-old girl suggests she try dipping the meat in the light broth as well. Tearful with joy, Kartika raves that the seafood broth works perfectly, crispy outside, fluffy inside, and absolutely bursting with flavor the instant it's dipped. Chuckling softly, the reincarnated Villainess says she's glad it's being enjoyed, while the little healer shakes her head violently and declares this the absolute best. Vibrating with generous excitement, Kartika insists she wants everyone else to savor this incredible meal too. Pressing a gloved hand to her lips with theatrical dismay, Lavianje sighs and oh dear and mournfully announces that the special Lavianje broth has completely run out. The shockwave of that single devastating sentence detonates across the campsite, striking Ralph and Loren like a physical blow. Screaming her title in absolute panic, the two boys come thundering across the clearing at full sprint while the century-old girl watches with placid amusement. Skewers are seized in a desperate, frantic scramble as the starving boys lunge for the food with primal urgency. Smiling serenely, the notorious Villainess casually confesses that she lied and there is actually plenty, so they needn't worry at all, praising their good work. Flushed and grinning around mouthfuls of grilled meat, Ralph and Loren dig in eagerly as she warmly urges them all to eat up. Storming toward the campfire in a red-faced fury, Enrique bellows that he wasn't finished talking to them yet. Gaping in scandalized, sputtering outrage at the feasting first years, the arrogant noble demands to know why on earth they are eating before their seniors. Beaming as though he had merely arrived fashionably late, the century-old girl greets the fuming noble warmly and urges him to sit down quickly, ignoring his sputtering insistence that they need to talk. Pressing a gloved finger to her chin with wide, guileless eyes, the reincarnated Villainess gently asks whether he really won't eat. Faltering visibly under her placid gaze, she softly wonders whether he intends to waste the food she poured her whole heart into making delicious, leaving him stammering that isn't what he meant. Handing out plates to every stunned upperclassman with brisk cheer, she declares she is glad she made it and firmly announces that he most certainly will eat it. Sweating helplessly, Enrique blurts that she's like a mother, no, a grandmother, while Lavianje giggles that he's figured out she's a granny and urges him to eat plenty and grow big. Utter defeat washes over the arrogant noble's face as the skewer is pushed insistently toward him. Grumbling that fine, if she insists that much, he'll eat it, Enrique finally takes a resigned bite. His eyes go wide with helpless, blushing astonishment as the flavor lands, and he quietly admits it's good. Melting one by one, Rim marvels that it's delicious, Mighty stares in reluctant wonder, and Mina notes it pairs beautifully dipped in the broth. Flushing scarlet around a mouthful of grilled meat, the elegant subleader sincerely tells her she has real talent for cooking. Cupping her cheek with a radiant, deeply satisfied smile, the century-old girl says she is so very glad they all enjoyed it. Ralph and Enrique tuck in side by side, the tension between the two teams finally dissolving into shared, ravenous appetite. 8 figures ring the crackling campfire together, eating in companionable quiet beneath the dark canopy. Sipping from her cup with closed, contented eyes, the ancient soul reflects that everyone sitting around the fire eating together is exactly the kind of camp she always wanted. Her eye gleams with sudden, sparkling anticipation as she wonders about indulging in some love talk, the way young people do. Tapping her chin thoughtfully, she notes that some of them already have fiancés, then muses that arranged matches might make the how we met question a touch tricky. Sighing wistfully amid floating visions of rice crackers and tea, she laments that if only they had snacks here, even those would make it more fun. A jolt of realization strikes her as she corrects herself, insisting that for young folks it would obviously have to be potato chips instead. Her cup is drained and rattled in her hand as she snaps abruptly back to the present moment. Turning with a warm, hostessing smile to the silently trembling leader, the reincarnated Villainess offers Ralph some more tea. Setting down his emptied plate, the stern-faced leader thanks the lady and quietly admits that now he's eaten, he can finally think calmly. Smiling graciously over her cup, the century-old girl says he's welcome and teases that camp is only just getting started and he's already finished. Raising a hand for attention, Ralph calls the whole camp to listen and declares they will move out tomorrow, because staying here means becoming food for the monsters. Cutting through the announcement with a sneering ha, Enrique demands to know who exactly gave the first year the authority to decide anything. Folding his arms with imperious finality, the arrogant noble declares they will wait for rescue right here, and that his word on the matter is absolutely final. Stunned disbelief ripples across every single face around the campfire as the two irreconcilable plans collide. Lowering her lashes, the ancient soul quietly turns the words over, "Wait for rescue," and murmurs that in that case. Pressing a gloved hand to her chin with cool, calculating eyes, the reincarnated Villainess concludes there is a very high chance they will all be wiped out, recognizing this moment as a true crossroads of fate.